The floorboards creaked with secrets. Each footstep across the rotting timber of 10, Rillington Place whispered of horrors that would soon shake an entire nation. Behind the peeling wallpaper and crumbling plaster lived a man whose gentle exterior masked the soul of a methodical killer. A predator who transformed his modest London home into a charnel house of unimaginable brutality. John Reginald Halliday Christie didn't hunt his victims through dark alleyways or abandoned warehouses. No, this monster preferred the comfort of his own domestic hell, where he could savor every moment of terror, every gasping breath, every final heartbeat. For over a decade, this unassuming clerk lured women into his lair with promises of medical help, only to deliver them into a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. What you're about to discover will chill you to your very core. A tale of systematic murder, sexual depravity, and psychological manipulation that defied comprehension. This is not just another crime story. This is the chronicle of how evil can flourish behind the most ordinary of faces, how death can lurk behind a caring smile, and how an entire neighborhood lived unknowingly above a tomb of unspeakable horrors. Welcome to the twisted world of John Christie, where mercy was a foreign concept and human life held no value whatsoever. Welcome to Crime Headquarters. I know many of you enjoy these stories to unwind and drift off to sleep, and tonight, you're in for something truly chilling and tragic. We'll be telling 5 different true crime stories in this video, each one more haunting than the last. So, get cozy, whether you're in bed or somewhere comfortable, and let go of the day. Before you let your mind drift off, take a moment to subscribe, like, share, and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, feel free to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and get ready. This is the story of the Rillington Place monster, the John Christie story. The year was 1899 when evil first drew breath in Halifax, Yorkshire. John Reginald Halliday Christie entered this world as the 6th of 7 children born to Ernest and Mary Christie, a family that would unknowingly nurture one of Britain's most calculating serial killers. From his earliest days, young Christie displayed the telltale signs of a disturbed mind festering with darkness. His childhood home became a laboratory of cruelty, where he conducted his first experiments in manipulation and control. While other children played with toys, Christie found his entertainment in torturing small animals, a grotesque preview of the horrors he would later inflict upon human beings. The boy's grandfather died when Christie was 8 years old, and this encounter with death became his perverted obsession. He insisted on viewing the corpse repeatedly, studying the pallor of lifeless skin, the stillness of death, images that would later fuel his murderous fantasies. Death, for Christie, became not an ending but a beginning, the moment when his victims would finally submit to his absolute control. School records reveal a pattern of disturbing behavior that should have served as a warning to the world. Christie was caught multiple times engaging in acts of voyeurism, peering through windows at unsuspecting women, his young mind already twisted with sexual deviance. Teachers noted his ability to lie with chilling conviction, crafting elaborate deceptions with the skill of a practiced sociopath. His adolescence brought new levels of depravity. Christie discovered that he could achieve sexual satisfaction only through violence and dominance. Normal relationships became impossible for him. He required fear, submission, and ultimately, death to reach fulfillment. The very essence of human connection was foreign to his corrupted psyche. At 17, Christie committed his first recorded crime, theft from his employer. But this was merely practice, a test of his ability to deceive and manipulate authority figures. When caught, he displayed no remorse, no shame, only cold calculation about how to avoid similar detection in the future. World War I provided Christie with legitimate opportunities to indulge his violent tendencies. He enlisted in 1916, but even warfare couldn't satisfy his particular brand of bloodlust. Traditional combat was too chaotic, too unpredictable for his methodical nature. Christie craved control, intimacy with his victims' final moments, something impossible on the battlefield. During the war, he claimed to have been gassed, resulting in temporary blindness and a permanent whisper that would later become his signature. Whether this injury was real or fabricated remains unclear, but Christie understood its psychological impact. The damaged voice made him appear vulnerable, trustworthy, the perfect camouflage for a predator. Returning from war, Christie married Ethel Simpson in 1920. Poor Ethel had no idea she was binding her life to a monster. Their marriage became a masterclass in psychological abuse as Christie perfected his techniques of manipulation and control. He isolated her from friends and family, creating a prison of emotional dependency that would last for decades. Christie's early career was marked by a series of petty crimes: theft, fraud, and assault. Each arrest taught him valuable lessons about avoiding detection. He studied the system, learned its weaknesses, and adapted his methods accordingly. By the 1930s, he had transformed from a clumsy criminal into a sophisticated predator. The couple moved to London in 1938, settling at 10 Rillington Place, an address that would become synonymous with horror. The narrow, three-story Victorian house in Notting Hill seemed ordinary enough, but Christie immediately recognized its potential. The building's layout provided perfect isolation, with thick walls that muffled sound and numerous hiding places for his dark secrets. Christie took a job as a clerk and began cultivating his public persona as a helpful, law-abiding citizen. Neighbors saw him as trustworthy, even joining the War Reserve Police during World War II. This position of authority gave him unprecedented access to vulnerable people and crucial knowledge about police procedures, information he would later use to stay ahead of investigators. During the war, Christie discovered his preferred method of murder: strangulation combined with carbon monoxide poisoning. The gas was readily available, and the method left his victims helpless while maintaining his complete control over the situation. He could watch the life drain from their eyes, savoring every moment of their final terror. His first confirmed victim was Ruth First, an Austrian refugee he encountered in 1943. Ruth was young, desperate, and completely alone, exactly the type of prey Christie preferred. He lured her to Rillington Place with promises of help, then subjected her to hours of sexual assault before strangling her with methodical precision. But Ruth was merely the beginning. Christie had discovered his true calling, and the confines of 10 Rillington Place would soon witness horrors that defied human comprehension. The monster had found his hunting ground, and he intended to use every inch of it. The transformation was complete. John Christie, the mild-mannered clerk, had perfected his disguise as a helpful neighbor while concealing the soul of an absolute predator. His killing ground was prepared, his methods refined, and his appetite for death had grown beyond all control. What followed would terrorize a nation and expose the horrifying truth that evil doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers softly, smiles warmly, and offers to help. The real horror was just beginning, and 10 Rillington Place would become a tomb that held secrets darker than anyone dared imagine. The stage was set for a decade of systematic murder that would shock the world and forever change how we understand the nature of human evil. Christie's killing spree was about to begin in earnest, and nothing would ever be the same again. The year 1943 marked the beginning of Christie's most prolific period, a decade of systematic murder that would transform 10 Rillington Place into Britain's most notorious house of horrors. What made Christie particularly terrifying wasn't the randomness of his violence, but the cold calculation with which he planned and executed each killing. Ruth First became the first official victim to die within those cursed walls, but her death was merely a rehearsal for the symphony of horror that would follow. Christie had spent months perfecting his technique, studying the layout of his home like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Every room became a potential killing ground, every corner a possible grave. The basement of 10 Rillington Place became Christie's primary workshop of death. Here, among the pipes and coal storage, he constructed his gas chamber, a crude but effective method of rendering victims unconscious before subjecting them to his final, brutal attentions. The carbon monoxide seeped through a rubber tube connected to the gas supply, creating an invisible weapon that left no obvious traces. Christie's selection process revealed the methodical nature of his madness. He specifically targeted vulnerable women, refugees, prostitutes, and those desperate for medical attention. His background as a war reserve police officer had taught him to identify society's most defenseless members, those whose disappearance would raise the fewest questions. The killer developed an elaborate ritual around each murder. He would first gain his victims' trust, often posing as someone with medical knowledge who could help with their problems. Christie was particularly skilled at identifying women suffering from respiratory problems or unwanted pregnancies, conditions that made them desperate enough to trust a stranger's offer of assistance. Once inside 10 Rillington Place, victims found themselves trapped in Christie's web of deception. He would lead them to the basement under the pretense of providing treatment, then activate his makeshift gas chamber. The carbon monoxide would render them semi-conscious but still aware, exactly the state Christie preferred for his final assault. What happened next defied human comprehension. While his victims lay helpless, Christie would subject them to prolonged sexual assault, savoring their inability to resist. He derived particular pleasure from watching their eyes, seeing the moment they realized their fate while being powerless to prevent it. This combination of helplessness and awareness was what Christie craved more than anything else. The strangulation came last, performed with Christie's own hands while he achieved sexual climax. He would wrap his fingers around their throats, feeling their pulse weaken and eventually stop while experiencing his twisted version of intimate connection. Death, for Christie, was the ultimate form of possession. Disposal of the bodies showcased Christie's meticulous planning. He had prepared multiple hiding places throughout the property, carefully calculated to avoid detection. The garden behind 10 Rillington Place became a graveyard, with bodies buried under cover of darkness in shallow graves that Christie would tend like macabre flower beds. Muriel Eady became his second confirmed victim in October 1944. A colleague from his wartime work, Muriel trusted Christie completely when he offered to help with her bronchial condition. She visited Rillington Place expecting medical treatment, and instead found herself breathing Christie's poisonous gas while he prepared to claim another life. Christie's treatment of Muriel revealed new depths of depravity. He kept her body in his home for days, treating the corpse as a perverted companion while continuing his normal routine. Neighbors reported strange smells coming from the property, but Christie's reputation as a helpful citizen deflected suspicion. The killer's relationship with his wife Ethel during this period demonstrated his complete lack of human empathy. While Christie was murdering women in their basement, Ethel remained upstairs, unaware that she was living directly above a charnel house. Christie compartmentalized his life with chilling efficiency, maintaining the facade of a loving husband while satisfying his murderous urges just floors below. What made Christie particularly dangerous was his ability to learn from each killing, refining his methods and improving his concealment techniques. He studied police procedures, read crime reports, and adjusted his approach based on how other killers had been caught. This wasn't random violence, it was methodical improvement in the art of murder. The post-war period brought new opportunities for Christie's predatory behavior. Rationing and housing shortages created desperate circumstances that he exploited mercilessly. Women seeking accommodation or medical help found themselves drawn to the soft-spoken man who promised solutions to their problems. Christie's gas chamber evolved with each use, becoming more efficient and deadly. He added refinements that prevented victims from crying out, installed better ventilation to protect himself from the fumes, and created storage areas specifically designed for concealing bodies until he could dispose of them permanently. The psychological torture Christie inflicted went far beyond the physical act of murder. He would often inform victims of their fate while they were helpless to prevent it, describing in detail what he planned to do to them. This mental cruelty was as important to him as the physical violence, perhaps even more so. By 1948, Christie had developed such confidence in his methods that he began taking greater risks. He started keeping personal items from his victims as trophies, creating a macabre museum of murder within his home. Each memento represented not just a life taken, but a moment of absolute power that Christie could revisit whenever he desired. The killer's ability to maintain his public facade while committing increasingly frequent murders spoke to his sophisticated understanding of human psychology. He knew exactly what persona to present to different people: helpful neighbor, concerned citizen, trustworthy authority figure, always adapting his mask to achieve maximum effect. As the 1940s drew to a close, Christie's appetite for death had grown beyond all control. The modest clerk who once stole small items from his employer had evolved into a sophisticated predator whose killing ground had claimed multiple lives. But his reign of terror was far from over. The worst was yet to come. The house at 10, Rillington Place, had become a monument to human evil, each room stained with the memory of innocent lives destroyed for one man's twisted pleasure. And Christie, intoxicated by his success at avoiding detection, was preparing to escalate his crimes to even more horrifying levels. The arrival of Timothy and Beryl Evans at 10, Rillington Place in 1948 marked the beginning of Christie's most audacious and horrifying period. The young couple, desperate for affordable housing, had no idea they were moving into the lair of a serial killer who viewed their presence not as an inconvenience, but as an opportunity for his most elaborate deception yet. Timothy Evans, a barely literate van driver with a quick temper, became Christie's perfect patsy. The older man immediately recognized Evans as someone he could manipulate, someone whose lack of education and volatile nature would make him an ideal suspect should suspicion ever fall on Rillington Place. Christie began cultivating their relationship with the patience of a spider spinning its web. Beryl Evans was pregnant with their second child when Christie made his move. The young mother was desperate to terminate the pregnancy, and Christie, presenting himself as someone with medical knowledge, offered to help. What Beryl didn't understand was that Christie had no intention of performing an abortion. He had found his next victim, and her desperation made her perfect prey. On November 8, 1949, Beryl Evans entered Christie's flat seeking help and instead found herself breathing his deadly gas. But Christie's treatment of Beryl revealed new depths of his depravity. Unlike his previous victims, Beryl was someone he knew personally, someone whose trust he had cultivated over months. Her murder represented a quantum leap in Christie's willingness to destroy innocent lives for his perverted pleasure. The sexual assault that followed Beryl's unconsciousness lasted for hours. Christie had perfected his technique, knowing exactly how long he could maintain his victim in a semi-conscious state before completing the strangulation. He derived particular satisfaction from Beryl's situation, a young mother seeking help for a desperate situation, only to become another trophy in his collection of the dead. But Christie's plans extended beyond Beryl alone. 14-month-old Geraldine Evans represented a witness who could never testify, but whose very existence complicated Christie's scheme. In an act of breathtaking callousness, Christie strangled the infant with a necktie, disposing of her tiny body alongside her mother's in the outdoor washhouse. What happened next demonstrated Christie's mastery of psychological manipulation. When Timothy Evans returned home to find his wife and daughter missing, Christie spun an elaborate tale about a botched abortion that had killed Beryl. He convinced the distraught husband that they needed to dispose of the body to avoid police attention, suggesting that Evans flee to Wales while Christie handled the cleanup. The psychological torture Christie inflicted on Timothy Evans was as cruel as his physical murders. He allowed the grieving husband to believe he was complicit in his wife's death, creating a web of guilt and confusion that would ultimately lead to Evans' execution for crimes Christie had committed. This manipulation represented perhaps Christie's most sophisticated act of evil. Not just killing, but ensuring an innocent man would die for his crimes. When Evans eventually went to the police, his confused and contradictory statements, the result of Christie's psychological manipulation, made him appear guilty. Christie, meanwhile, testified as a prosecution witness, presenting himself as the helpful neighbor who had tried to assist the troubled couple. His performance was masterful, combining just the right amount of reluctance with civic duty. The execution of Timothy Evans on March 9, 1950, represented the pinnacle of Christie's manipulation. He had not only murdered a wife and child, but had orchestrated the judicial murder of an innocent man. For Christie, this represented the ultimate expression of his power, the ability to manipulate the very system designed to catch him into doing his bidding. But Evans' execution only whetted Christie's appetite for more elaborate crimes. Having successfully evaded suspicion while disposing of an entire family, he began planning his most audacious murders yet. His confidence had reached dangerous levels, and he started taking risks that would have terrified him in earlier years. The early 1950s brought a new phase of Christie's killing spree. He began targeting women with increasing frequency, luring them to Rillington Place with refined versions of his medical deception. Each murder built upon lessons learned from previous killings, creating an ever more efficient machine of death. Rita Nelson fell victim to Christie's evolved techniques in January 1953. A pregnant prostitute seeking help, she trusted Christie's offer of assistance and found herself in his gas chamber, breathing poison while he prepared for another night of horrific violence. But Christie's treatment of Rita showed new levels of sadistic creativity. He kept her body in his home for days, using it for his perverted pleasure while maintaining his normal routine. Kathleen Maloney became Christie's next victim just weeks later. Another prostitute seeking medical help, she followed the same path as her predecessors, trusting Christie's helpful demeanor until it was too late. But Christie's disposal of Kathleen's body revealed his growing recklessness. He was running out of hiding places and making increasingly desperate attempts to conceal his crimes. The murder of Hectorina McLennan in March 1953 marked Christie's final confirmed killing, though investigators suspected there were others. Hectorina, just 26 years old, had been living rough and was desperate for shelter when Christie made his offer of help. Her death followed the same horrific pattern as the others, but Christie's concealment of her body showed signs of panic. He was losing control. Throughout this period, Christie's wife Ethel remained in the house, apparently unaware of the horrors occurring just rooms away. Her presence during these murders raised disturbing questions about what she might have known or suspected. Christie's ability to compartmentalize his life had reached such extremes that he could murder women while his wife slept upstairs. The psychological profile that emerged from this period revealed Christie as perhaps Britain's most calculating serial killer. Unlike random killers driven by sudden impulses, Christie planned each murder with methodical precision. He studied his victims, identified their vulnerabilities, and crafted specific deceptions designed to lure them into his trap. Christie's sexual pathology had evolved to require increasingly elaborate scenarios of control and domination. Simple murder was no longer sufficient. He needed the psychological complexity of deception, the extended period of helplessness, and the intimate connection of manual strangulation. Each element was essential to his perverted satisfaction. The killer's relationship with death itself had become completely perverted. Where normal people feared death and grieved its occurrence, Christie celebrated it as the moment of ultimate possession. His victims belonged to him completely only in death, and he treated their corpses with the twisted tenderness he had never shown to living people. As 1953 progressed, Christie's House of Horrors was reaching capacity. Bodies hidden in alcoves, buried in gardens, and concealed in washhouses were beginning to create problems that even his meticulous planning couldn't solve. The stench of decomposition was becoming noticeable, and Christie was running out of places to hide his victims. More dangerously, Christie's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. Neighbors reported strange noises, foul smells, and odd behavior from the usually reliable man. His decades of successful deception were finally beginning to crack under the weight of his accumulated crimes. The stage was set for Christie's downfall, but not before he would commit one final act of horror that would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of his depravity. The monster of Rillington Place was about to face his greatest challenge, the discovery of his crimes and the unraveling of his carefully constructed web of lies. The year 1953 would prove to be John Christie's last as a free man, but not before he committed his most shocking murder yet, the killing of his own wife, Ethel. After nearly 33 years of marriage, during which she had remained loyal despite his increasingly erratic behavior, Ethel became Christie's final victim in an act that demonstrated the complete absence of human feeling in his corrupted soul. Ethel's murder differed from Christie's previous crimes in its domestic intimacy. Unlike the strangers he had lured to their deaths, Ethel trusted him completely, never suspecting that the man she had shared a bed with for decades was planning her destruction. On the morning of December 14, 1952, Christie strangled his wife while she lay sleeping, then spent the entire day with her corpse, calmly making arrangements for what he told neighbors would be her extended visit to family. The disposal of Ethel's body revealed Christie's deteriorating mental state. Instead of his usual meticulous planning, he hastily buried her under the floorboards of their front room, covering the grave with linoleum and furniture. This careless concealment would prove to be his undoing, but in his arrogance, Christie believed he could continue his charade indefinitely. With Ethel dead, Christie's behavior became increasingly bizarre. He told neighbors conflicting stories about his wife's whereabouts, sold her wedding ring and personal belongings, and even forged her signature to access her bank account. The helpful neighbor persona that had protected him for so long was cracking under the strain of maintaining multiple deceptions simultaneously. In March 1953, Christie made the decision that would seal his fate. He moved out of 10 Rillington Place. The house had become his prison as much as his killing ground, filled with bodies and memories that were driving him toward complete mental collapse. But his departure would soon lead to discoveries that would horrify the world and expose the true extent of his crimes. The new tenants who moved into Christie's flat were Beresford Brown and his wife. They immediately noticed the foul stench permeating the property, but Christie had dismissed their concerns as normal odors from the building's old plumbing. What they didn't realize was that they were literally living on top of multiple graves, breathing air contaminated by decomposing corpses. On March 24, 1953, Beresford Brown was attempting to install a radio shelf in the kitchen when he made a discovery that would change everything. Tapping on the walls to find a secure mounting point, he noticed one section sounded hollow. When he peeled back the wallpaper to investigate, he found himself staring into an alcove containing the partially mummified body of a woman. The horror of Brown's discovery cannot be overstated. The body, later identified as Hectorina McLennan, was positioned in a sitting posture, her legs bound with electrical cord, her body wrapped in a blanket. But this was only the beginning. Further investigation of the alcove revealed two more bodies, those of Kathleen Maloney and Rita Nelson, arranged in the same grotesque display. Police arrived at 10 Rillington Place within hours, and what they found defied comprehension. The three bodies in the kitchen alcove were just the beginning of an investigation that would uncover the true extent of Christie's decade-long killing spree. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last, painting a picture of systematic murder that shocked even experienced detectives. Detective Chief Inspector Albert Griffin, who led the investigation, later described the scene as the most disturbing crime scene he had encountered in 30 years of police work. The methodical way Christie had concealed the bodies, the evidence of prolonged sexual assault, and the sheer number of victims created a case that challenged everyone's understanding of human evil. The search of the garden behind 10 Rillington Place revealed the remains of Ethel Christie, buried in such a shallow grave that her body was easily discovered. But more excavation uncovered additional horrors: the skeletons of Ruth First and Muriel Eady, Christie's first confirmed victims from nearly a decade earlier. Each grave told a story of careful planning and complete disregard for human life. Inside the house, investigators found Christie's gas apparatus still connected and ready for use. The rubber tube, the makeshift chamber, and the ventilation system he had constructed revealed the mechanical precision with which he had conducted his murders. This wasn't crime of passion. It was industrial-scale killing designed for maximum efficiency and minimal detection. The psychological impact on the investigating officers was severe. Many had to take extended leave after witnessing the horrors of Rillington Place. The crime scene photographs, which remain classified to this day, allegedly show evidence of sexual mutilation and post-mortem abuse that defied description. Christie had treated his victims' bodies with a depravity that challenged human comprehension. Meanwhile, Christie himself had become a fugitive, wandering the streets of London in a confused state of paranoia and grandiose delusion. His decades of successful deception had convinced him that he could somehow escape justice, but his deteriorating mental condition made him increasingly conspicuous to authorities. The manhunt for Christie became one of the largest in British history. His photograph appeared on the front page of every newspaper, and police received hundreds of sightings from across the country. The public's fascination with the case was matched only by their horror at the revelations emerging from Rillington Place. On March 31, 1953, Police Constable Thomas Ledger spotted Christie near Putney Bridge, wandering aimlessly along the Thames embankment. The once proud killer had deteriorated into a shambling wreck, his clothes dirty, his demeanor confused and defeated. When arrested, Christie initially gave a false name, but his identity was quickly confirmed. Christie's arrest marked the beginning of what would become one of the most sensational trials in British legal history. The evidence against him was overwhelming: bodies in his home, personal possessions from victims in his possession, and his own eventual confession to multiple murders. But Christie's legal strategy would prove almost as shocking as his crimes. During police interviews, Christie demonstrated the same calculating nature that had made him such an effective killer. He admitted to murdering his wife and the 3 women found in the alcove, but maintained his innocence in the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, the murders for which Timothy Evans had been executed 3 years earlier. The implications of Christie's confession sent shockwaves through the British justice system. If Christie had murdered the Evans family, then an innocent man had been executed for crimes he didn't commit. The case would eventually lead to the abolition of capital punishment in Britain, but for Timothy Evans, justice would come too late. Christie's trial began on June 22, 1953, at the Old Bailey. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, presenting evidence of systematic murder that spanned nearly a decade. Christie's defense team attempted to argue insanity, but the calculated nature of his crimes made such a defense nearly impossible to sustain. The killer's courtroom demeanor revealed the same manipulative personality that had made him so dangerous. He attempted to present himself as a victim of circumstances, claiming that his victims had died accidentally during his attempts to help them. This final deception fooled no one. The evidence of premeditation and sexual sadism was too overwhelming. On June 25, 1953, after deliberating for just 85 minutes, the jury found John Reginald Halliday Christie guilty of murder. Judge Mr. Justice Finnemore sentenced him to death, condemning him for crimes that had shocked the civilized world. Christie showed no emotion as his fate was pronounced, maintaining his facade of respectability until the very end. The execution of John Christie took place on July 15, 1953, at Pentonville Prison. He spent his final weeks writing an autobiography that revealed nothing new about his crimes while attempting to justify his actions as mercy killings. Even facing death, Christie remained committed to his delusional version of events. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, later wrote that Christie was one of the most composed condemned men he had ever encountered. The killer walked to the gallows with the same quiet dignity he had maintained throughout his double life, carrying his secrets to the grave with characteristic calculation. The demolition of 10 Rillington Place in 1970 marked the physical end of Britain's most notorious house of horrors, but Christie's legacy continued to influence criminal investigation techniques and legal procedures. His case became a textbook study in serial killing behavior, revealing patterns that would help investigators identify similar killers in future cases. The Christie murders exposed fundamental flaws in police investigation methods and highlighted the dangers of circumstantial evidence in capital cases. The wrongful execution of Timothy Evans became a rallying cry for opponents of the death penalty, ultimately contributing to its abolition throughout the British Commonwealth. But perhaps Christie's most lasting impact was the revelation of how effectively evil can disguise itself. His ability to maintain a respectable facade while committing horrific murders challenged society's assumptions about the nature of criminal behavior. The monster of Rillington Place proved that the most dangerous predators don't announce themselves. They smile, offer help, and gain trust before revealing their true nature. The case of John Christie remains one of history's most disturbing examples of human depravity. His systematic murder of at least 8 people, his manipulation of the justice system to execute an innocent man, and his complete lack of remorse created a legacy of horror that continues to fascinate and terrify more than 70 years later. Justice was finally served when Christie paid the ultimate price for his crimes, but the memory of his victims and the horror of their final moments serves as a permanent reminder of humanity's capacity for evil. The house at 10 Rillington Place may be gone, but the darkness Christie brought into the world will never be forgotten. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, The Versace Killer, Andrew Cunanan's Reign of Terror. Blood spattered across marble steps, a fashion icon's final breath echoing through Miami's exclusive streets. 5 bodies scattered across America like breadcrumbs leading to madness. This is not fiction. This is the horrifying true story of Andrew Cunanan, a charismatic predator who transformed from socialite to serial killer, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would culminate in one of the most shocking celebrity murders in American history. What drives a man to methodically hunt and destroy? What twisted psychology compels someone to execute 5 innocent souls with calculated brutality? The answers lie within the dark corridors of Andrew Cunanan's mind, a labyrinth of narcissism, rage, and violence that would terrorize a nation for 3 months in 1997. This is the story of a killer who wore designer suits while planning murder, a man who smiled at parties while plotting death, a predator who used charm as his weapon and left chaos as his signature. Welcome to the nightmare that was Andrew Cunanan's killing spree, where luxury met lunacy, and where 5 families would never be whole again. The transformation from human to hunter rarely occurs overnight. Andrew Philip Cunanan's metamorphosis into one of America's most notorious serial killers began decades before his first victim drew their final breath. Born into a world where appearance mattered more than substance, Cunanan learned early that manipulation could open doors that honesty never could. San Diego's affluent neighborhoods provided the perfect breeding ground for a future predator. Cunanan's childhood home wasn't just a residence. It was a theater where the young boy perfected the art of deception. His father, Modesto, painted pictures of wealth and success while secretly drowning in financial quicksand. His mother, Marian, desperately clung to social status even as their world crumbled around them. Young Andrew absorbed these lessons in duplicity like a sponge soaking up poison. The warning signs emerged early, subtle at first, then growing more pronounced with each passing year. Teachers noted his exceptional intelligence paired with an unsettling ability to lie without hesitation. Classmates remembered his magnetic personality, shadowed by moments of explosive rage when things didn't unfold according to his desires. Cunanan possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, identifying their weaknesses and exploiting them with surgical precision. By his teenage years, Cunanan had already begun constructing the elaborate fantasy life that would later fuel his murderous rampage. He fabricated stories about family wealth, claiming his father was a successful businessman rather than a struggling stockbroker drowning in debt. He invented connections to celebrities and spoke fluent lies about exotic vacations to places he'd never visited. The truth became optional in Andrew's world, an inconvenience to be discarded whenever it interfered with his grandiose self-image. The collapse came suddenly and devastatingly. When Cunanan was 19, the family's financial house of cards finally tumbled. His father, facing fraud charges, fled to the Philippines in the dead of night, leaving behind a family destroyed by his deceptions. The revelation that their comfortable life had been built on lies shattered something fundamental in Andrew's psyche. The abandonment by his father, the man he'd both worshipped and learned to emulate, created a wound that would never heal, festering into the rage that would later claim 5 innocent lives. San Diego's gay community welcomed the charismatic young man who seemed to possess unlimited charm and sophistication. Cunanan reinvented himself as a wealthy socialite, spinning tales of inherited fortunes and family connections to European nobility. He attended exclusive parties, dated successful older men, and lived a lifestyle funded entirely by deception and manipulation. Those who knew him during this period described a man who could be utterly captivating one moment and coldly calculating the next. The gay clubs and upscale restaurants of Hillcrest became Cunanan's hunting grounds, not yet for murder, but for victims to financially exploit. He perfected the art of the long con, identifying wealthy men seeking companionship and slowly bleeding them dry through elaborate schemes and emotional manipulation. His victims often didn't realize they'd been robbed until long after Cunanan had moved on to his next target. Drug use accelerated Cunanan's descent into darkness. Methamphetamine became his constant companion, fueling paranoid fantasies and amplifying his already unstable personality. Friends noticed dramatic mood swings, violent outbursts followed by periods of manic euphoria. The drugs stripped away whatever restraint he'd possessed, leaving behind a creature driven purely by narcissistic rage and materialistic greed. The transformation was complete by his mid-20s. The charming socialite had evolved into something far more dangerous, a predator who viewed other human beings as objects to be used and discarded. His relationships became purely transactional, his friendships calculated opportunities for exploitation. Love, empathy, and genuine human connection had been surgically removed from his emotional vocabulary, replaced by an insatiable hunger for admiration, wealth, and control. Cunanan's first serious relationship ended in spectacular failure when his partner discovered the extent of his lies and theft. The rejection triggered something primal in Andrew's damaged psyche. For the first time, someone had seen through his carefully constructed facade and found him wanting. The humiliation was unbearable for someone whose entire identity depended on maintaining the illusion of superiority and desirability. The fantasies began during this period, elaborate revenge scenarios where those who'd wronged him paid the ultimate price. Cunanan would spend hours visualizing the destruction of his enemies, savoring every detail of their imagined suffering. These mental rehearsals served as both catharsis and preparation for the horrors that would soon unfold across the American landscape. By early 1997, multiple factors had converged to create the perfect storm of violence. Cunanan's drug use had reached dangerous levels, his finances were completely depleted, and his network of sugar daddies had finally recognized him for the parasite he'd become. More importantly, his HIV-positive status, whether real or imagined, had convinced him that his time was running short. The diagnosis became the final catalyst that transformed fantasy into deadly reality. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Cunanan learned that his former lover, David Madsen, was living happily in Minneapolis with a new partner. The news struck like a physical blow, shattering what remained of his carefully constructed self-image. Here was proof that life could continue without Andrew Cunanan, that he was, in fact, replaceable and ultimately irrelevant. Something snapped in that moment. The elaborate facade that had sustained him for years crumbled, revealing the monster that had always lurked underneath. The time for games and manipulation had ended. If Andrew Cunanan couldn't have love, wealth, and admiration, then he would settle for something else entirely. Fear, notoriety, and the absolute power that comes from holding someone else's life in your hands. The hunt was about to begin. April 27th, 1997. The date would forever mark the beginning of a nightmare that would terrorize America for the next 3 months. Jeffrey Trail's apartment in Minneapolis became the first crime scene in what would become one of the most brutal killing sprees in modern history. The violence that erupted that evening was so savage, so utterly without mercy, that it defied comprehension. Trail, a respected naval officer who had served his country with distinction, never saw the attack coming. The 28-year-old had agreed to meet his former friend Andrew Cunanan, perhaps hoping to reconcile after their relationship had soured. What he encountered instead was a creature driven by rage, jealousy, and an insatiable hunger for destruction. The meeting had been orchestrated under false pretenses. Cunanan had convinced Trail that they needed to discuss their mutual friend David Madsen's welfare. The weapon of choice revealed the personal nature of Cunanan's rage. A claw hammer, brutal, intimate, requiring the killer to get close enough to see the life drain from his victim's eyes. The attack was frenzied, far exceeding what was necessary to kill. 27 devastating blows rained down on Trail's skull, each impact driven by years of accumulated hatred and narcissistic injury. Blood painted the walls in abstract patterns of violence, while bone fragments scattered across expensive carpeting. The aftermath was equally telling. Rather than fleeing immediately, Cunanan took time to stage the scene with theatrical precision. Trail's body was wrapped in an oriental rug like some grotesque gift, then positioned to maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered the remains. This wasn't just murder, it was performance art painted in blood and terror. David Madsen arrived at the apartment shortly after the killing, walking unknowingly into a nightmare that would cost him his life. The successful architect found his former lover standing over Trail's corpse, hammer still dripping crimson evidence of the brutality that had just unfolded. What followed remains one of the most chilling examples of psychological manipulation in criminal history. Cunanan didn't immediately kill Madsen. Instead, he deployed his most dangerous weapon, his charismatic personality. Over the next 4 days, he held Madsen captive through a combination of terror, false promises, and emotional manipulation. Neighbors later reported seeing the two men together, appearing almost normal despite the decomposing corpse hidden inside the apartment. This ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while orchestrating horror would become Cunanan's signature throughout his killing spree. The psychological torture Madsen endured during those 4 days can barely be imagined. Cunanan alternated between threats of immediate violence and promises of escape, keeping his captive in a constant state of terror and desperate hope. The killer seemed to relish this power over another human being, savoring the absolute control that comes from holding someone's life in the balance. On May 3rd, the torture ended with a single gunshot to Madsen's head. The location was carefully chosen, East Rush Lake, 40 miles north of Minneapolis. The isolated setting ensured that Madsen's final moments were witnessed only by his killer and the indifferent wilderness. Cunanan used Trail's own service pistol for the execution, adding another layer of psychological violation to an already unspeakable crime. The discovery of Madsen's body sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. 2 brutal murders in less than a week, connected by a single perpetrator who seemed to kill with both calculated planning and explosive rage. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit recognized immediately that they were dealing with a killer unlike any they'd encountered before. Someone who combined the methodical planning of an organized offender with the chaotic violence of a disorganized one. But Cunanan was just getting started. The taste of absolute power had awakened something primal in his damaged psyche. The careful social climber who had spent years manipulating his way through San Diego's elite circles had evolved into something far more dangerous. A predator who had discovered that taking lives provided the ultimate rush of superiority and control. The next target was selected with chilling randomness. Lee Miglin, a 72-year-old real estate mogul in Chicago, had never met Andrew Cunanan. The successful businessman had built a fortune through hard work and legitimate enterprise, everything that Cunanan despised about the world that had rejected him. Miglin represented the establishment, the successful older men who had once funded Cunanan's lifestyle but had ultimately seen through his deceptions. The attack on Miglin was the most savage yet. Cunanan didn't just kill. He tortured, humiliated, and utterly destroyed his victim with methodical precision. The elderly man was bound with duct tape and subjected to hours of psychological and physical torment before finally being allowed to die. The killer used a screwdriver to puncture Miglin's chest repeatedly, then wrapped his head in masking tape, suffocating him slowly while savoring every moment of his victim's agony. The crime scene revealed new dimensions to Cunanan's evolving pathology. After killing Miglin, he remained in the house for hours, methodically going through his victim's possessions and helping himself to clothing, jewelry, and cash. He showered in Miglin's bathroom, slept in his bed, and ate food from his refrigerator. This wasn't just theft. It was a complete psychological invasion, an attempt to literally inhabit his victim's life. The discovery of Miglin's body on May 4th confirmed law enforcement's worst fears. The killer was escalating both in frequency and brutality. The 3-day gap between murders suggested someone who was becoming increasingly comfortable with violence, someone for whom killing was transforming from necessity to pleasure. The FBI expanded their task force and issued nationwide alerts, but Cunanan seemed to stay one step ahead of the manhunt closing in around him. The stolen Lexus that Cunanan drove away from the Miglin murder scene became a rolling advertisement for his crimes. Rather than attempting to maintain a low profile, the killer seemed to relish the attention his actions were generating. He drove the distinctive vehicle openly, making no effort to disguise his identity or alter his appearance. This brazenness suggested either supreme confidence or complete indifference to capture, both equally dangerous characteristics in a serial killer. Media coverage of the murders began to transform Cunanan from criminal to celebrity. His photograph appeared on magazine covers alongside sensationalized accounts of his crimes. The attention fed his narcissistic personality like gasoline thrown on a fire. For the first time in his life, Andrew Cunanan was famous. Not for the fictional achievements he'd spent years fabricating, but for something real, something that commanded genuine fear and respect. The psychological profile that emerged from the first 3 murders painted a picture of a killer unlike any in FBI records. Cunanan displayed characteristics of multiple offender types. The organized killer's careful planning, the disorganized killer's explosive violence, and the mission-oriented killer's specific target selection. He was creating new rules for serial murder, making him nearly impossible to predict or apprehend using traditional investigative methods. As May progressed, law enforcement agencies across the country braced for the next attack. They knew with terrible certainty that Cunanan would kill again. The only questions were when, where, and who would be unlucky enough to cross paths with America's most wanted fugitive. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, and it would claim the life of a young man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The cemetery in Pennsville Township, New Jersey, became the setting for Cunanan's 4th act of murder on May 9, 1997. William Reese, a 45-year-old caretaker at Finns Point National Cemetery, was simply doing his job when he encountered the fleeing killer. Reese had dedicated his life to maintaining the final resting place of Civil War soldiers, men who had died serving their country with honor. The irony of his own death at the hands of a coward who preyed on innocent victims was not lost on those who knew him. Unlike the previous murders, Reese's killing lacked the personal rage that had characterized Cunanan's earlier crimes. This was execution pure and simple, a cold, calculated act committed solely to acquire the victim's red Chevrolet pickup truck. The single gunshot to Reese's head demonstrated Cunanan's evolution as a killer. Gone was the frenzied violence of the claw hammer attack on Jeffrey Trail. In its place was something far more chilling: the methodical efficiency of a predator who had learned to kill without emotion. The transformation of the crime scene told its own horrifying story. After shooting Reese, Cunanan took time to position the body, almost as if staging a macabre photograph. The caretaker's tools were arranged around the corpse in a pattern that suggested ritual significance, though investigators could never determine what message, if any, the killer was trying to convey. This attention to detail in the aftermath of murder revealed a mind that found artistic expression in death and destruction. The stolen pickup truck became Cunanan's chariot of terror as he fled south toward Florida. Law enforcement agencies coordinated a massive manhunt, but the killer seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to evade capture. He drove through multiple states, passing countless police checkpoints and surveillance cameras, yet somehow remained invisible to the dragnet closing around him. During this journey, Cunanan's psychological state continued to deteriorate. Witnesses who encountered him at gas stations and restaurants described a man who appeared increasingly paranoid and unstable. His carefully maintained appearance began to crumble, revealing the monster that lurked underneath the designer clothing and practiced charm. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his hands shook with drug-induced tremors, and his conversation became increasingly erratic and threatening. The methamphetamine that had fueled his initial killing spree was now consuming him from within. Days without sleep had transformed his face into a gaunt mask of barely controlled rage. The drug's effects amplified every aspect of his already unstable personality. His narcissism became megalomaniacal, his paranoia reached psychotic levels, and his capacity for violence expanded beyond all reasonable bounds. Florida's tropical paradise became the backdrop for the final act of Cunanan's killing spree. Miami Beach, with its concentration of wealth, celebrity, and excess, provided the perfect stage for a killer who craved attention and notoriety above all else. The exclusive South Beach district, where fashion models and entertainment moguls mingled with international playboys and drug dealers, offered exactly the kind of high-profile hunting ground that would satisfy Cunanan's desperate need for recognition. The killer established himself in the area by becoming a ghost, sleeping in stolen cars, showering at public beaches, and sustaining himself through petty theft and prostitution. Witnesses later reported seeing him at various South Beach nightclubs and restaurants, always alone, always watching, always planning. His appearance during this period was described as haggard and desperate, a far cry from the polished socialite who had once charmed his way through San Diego's elite circles. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation was closing in on multiple fronts. Behavioral analysts had developed an increasingly accurate psychological profile of the killer, while forensic evidence from the crime scenes provided crucial physical evidence linking Cunanan to all 4 murders. His photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, and a substantial reward was offered for information leading to his capture. The media coverage had transformed Cunanan into a household name, though not for the reasons he had originally craved. Television news programs featured hourly updates on the manhunt, while newspapers devoted front-page coverage to every development in the case. The killer had achieved the fame he had always desired, but it was the fame of a monster, not the celebrity status he had spent his life pursuing. This media attention had an unexpected effect on Cunanan's psychology. Rather than driving him into deeper hiding, the coverage seemed to energize him, feeding his narcissistic hunger for recognition. Former acquaintances who were interviewed by reporters described a man obsessed with image and status, someone who would rather be notorious than invisible. This psychological insight would prove prophetic in understanding his final, most shocking crime. The strain of maintaining his fugitive existence began to show in increasingly erratic behavior. Cunanan was spotted at several South Beach locations acting aggressively toward strangers, as if seeking confrontation. Hotel employees reported encounters with a man matching his description who became violently angry when questioned about his identity or asked to produce identification. The psychological pressure of the manhunt was clearly taking its toll, pushing an already unstable killer toward his breaking point. Law enforcement officials recognized the signs of a spree killer reaching the end of his psychological rope. Profilers warned that Cunanan was likely to commit one final, spectacular act of violence before either surrendering or taking his own life. The prediction proved tragically accurate, though nobody could have anticipated the specific target he would choose for his grand finale. The exclusive Casa Casuarina mansion on Ocean Drive became the focal point of law enforcement surveillance during July 1997. Intelligence suggested that Cunanan might attempt to target high-profile residents or visitors to the South Beach area, and the mansion's famous owner made it a natural location for protective monitoring. However, the killer's ability to remain undetected while moving freely through the very neighborhoods where police were searching for him demonstrated a level of cunning that continued to frustrate investigators. As July progressed, multiple credible sightings of Cunanan were reported throughout the Miami area. The killer seemed to be escalating his risk-taking behavior, appearing in increasingly public venues despite the massive law enforcement presence seeking his capture. This pattern suggested someone who was either completely confident in his ability to evade capture or someone who had already decided that his killing spree would end with his own death. The final piece of Cunanan's murderous puzzle was about to fall into place. His target was already chosen, his methods planned, and his escape route mapped. What happened next would shock the world and cement Andrew Cunanan's place in criminal history as one of America's most notorious killers. The morning of July 15, 1997, would bring an end to the manhunt in the most spectacular and tragic way possible. Dawn broke over Miami Beach on July 15, 1997, painting the sky in deceptive pastels that belied the horror about to unfold. Gianni Versace, the legendary fashion designer whose creative genius had revolutionized haute couture, began what would be his final morning in the mansion he called home. The 50-year-old Italian master of luxury and beauty had no way of knowing that death was stalking him, wearing the face of a desperate killer whose psychological breakdown had finally reached its crescendo. Versace's morning ritual was as elegant as everything else in his carefully orchestrated life. He walked to the news cafe on Ocean Drive, purchased magazines and coffee, then strolled back toward the palatial Casa Casuarina that served as both residence and inspiration for his artistic endeavors. The designer moved through his neighborhood like a king surveying his domain, acknowledged by admirers and protected by the invisible barrier of celebrity that had always shielded him from the harsh realities that ordinary people faced. Andrew Cunanan had been watching for days, learning his target's patterns with the patience of a professional assassin. The killer's deteriorated appearance, sunken cheeks, bloodshot eyes, clothes that reeked of desperation and madness, contrasted sharply with the opulent surroundings of South Beach's exclusive district. Yet somehow he remained invisible to the very people whose lives he was planning to destroy, a ghost haunting paradise while preparing for his final performance. The convergence occurred at exactly 8:45 a.m. on the steps of Casa Casuarina. Versace, returning from his morning walk, was fumbling with his keys when Cunanan approached from behind. There was no conversation, no dramatic confrontation, no opportunity for the victim to plead for his life or attempt to reason with his killer. This was execution, swift and merciless, delivered by someone who had learned that murder could provide the ultimate expression of power and control. The first shot struck Versace in the back of the head, the impact driving him forward against the ornate gates of his own home. The designer's blood began to pool on the marble steps where countless celebrities and dignitaries had once been welcomed as honored guests. But Cunanan wasn't finished. As Versace lay dying, the killer stepped closer and fired a second shot directly into his victim's face, obliterating the features that had graced magazine covers and launched 1,000 fashion dreams. The sound of gunshots shattered the morning tranquility of Ocean Drive, sending tourists and residents fleeing in terror. Witnesses watched in horror as Cunanan calmly walked away from the scene, showing no signs of panic or remorse. He had just murdered one of the world's most recognizable figures in broad daylight, in full view of multiple witnesses, yet he moved with the casual confidence of someone taking a morning stroll. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scope of Cunanan's psychological breakdown. Rather than fleeing immediately, he returned to the stolen houseboat where he had been hiding for the past week. This decision demonstrated either supreme arrogance or complete indifference to capture, both equally terrifying characteristics in someone who had just committed the most high-profile assassination in recent American history. News of Versace's murder exploded across global media within minutes. The fashion world reacted with shock and grief as tributes poured in from celebrities, models, and industry leaders whose careers had been shaped by the designer's vision. But the broader public was gripped by something else entirely: the realization that Andrew Cunanan had escalated from targeting unknown victims to murdering an international celebrity, someone whose death would command worldwide attention. Law enforcement response was immediate and overwhelming. The FBI, Miami police, and multiple federal agencies converged on South Beach with military-style precision. Roadblocks were established, airports were monitored, and a door-to-door search began that would eventually encompass the entire Miami metropolitan area. The manhunt that had consumed law enforcement resources for 3 months was about to reach its explosive conclusion. The psychological profile of the crime revealed new dimensions to Cunanan's pathology. The selection of Versace as a target wasn't random. It was calculated to achieve maximum media impact and cement the killer's place in criminal history. Versace represented everything that Cunanan had always craved but never possessed: legitimate fame, artistic achievement, and universal admiration. By destroying the designer, Cunanan was attempting to absorb some of that recognition for himself, even if it came through notoriety rather than accomplishment. The investigation quickly focused on the floating crack house where Cunanan had been hiding since arriving in Miami. The houseboat, owned by a German immigrant who had fled the country when police attention intensified, had become the killer's final refuge. Neighbors reported strange sounds and suspicious activity in the days leading up to the Versace murder, but their concerns had been dismissed by authorities who were searching for Cunanan in more conventional locations. On July 23, 1997, 8 days after the Versace assassination, police finally traced Cunanan to his hiding place. The houseboat was surrounded by a small army of law enforcement officers, snipers, and federal agents. Loudspeakers blared demands for surrender, while helicopters circled overhead, creating a media spectacle that was broadcast live to millions of viewers around the world. What happened next inside the houseboat remains one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. As police prepared to storm the vessel, a single gunshot rang out from within. When officers finally breached the cabin, they found Andrew Cunanan's body on a bed, killed by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The same weapon that had been used to murder Versace became the instrument of the killer's own destruction. The suicide ended the manhunt but raised countless questions about the motivations behind the killing spree. Cunanan left no suicide note, no explanation for his actions, no insight into the psychological forces that had transformed him from social parasite into serial killer. The silence was perhaps the most fitting end for someone whose entire life had been built on lies, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of truth. The crime scenes told their own story of a mind completely detached from human empathy. Forensic evidence revealed that Cunanan had spent his final days on the houseboat in conditions of absolute squalor, surrounded by empty liquor bottles, drug paraphernalia, and pornographic magazines. The contrast between his former aspirations to luxury and his final degraded circumstances provided a stark illustration of how far his psychological breakdown had progressed. The aftermath of Cunanan's death brought closure to the families of his 5 victims, but it also raised disturbing questions about the society that had created him. His killing spree had exposed the dark underbelly of America's obsession with celebrity, wealth, and status. The killer had spent his entire adult life attempting to buy, steal, or manipulate his way into the lifestyle he believed he deserved, and when those efforts failed, he had chosen to achieve recognition through the ultimate expression of nihilistic rage. The global impact of the Versace murder extended far beyond the fashion industry. Security protocols for celebrities were completely overhauled. Law enforcement agencies restructured their approaches to tracking serial killers, and the media began questioning its role in creating the celebrity culture that had both fascinated and ultimately destroyed Andrew Cunanan. 5 innocent people had died during Cunanan's 3-month reign of terror. Jeffrey Trail, David Madsen, Lee Miglin, William Reese, and Johnny Versace. Each had been living productive, meaningful lives before encountering the killer who destroyed them without remorse or justification. Their deaths served as a stark reminder that evil can wear a charming smile and expensive clothes while planning unspeakable acts of violence. The Cunanan case remains one of the most studied examples of spree killing in criminal psychology literature. His ability to evade capture while committing increasingly bold crimes, his escalation from personal revenge to random violence, and his final spectacular suicide created a template that investigators still use when profiling similar offenders. The case proved that the most dangerous killers are often those who combine high intelligence with complete moral bankruptcy. Andrew Cunanan's story ended where it began, with death, destruction, and the complete absence of redemption. His final act of self-destruction denied society the opportunity to understand the psychological forces that had created one of America's most notorious killers. The silence of his suicide spoke louder than any confession could have, confirming that some evil is so complete, so utterly without justification, that it defies rational explanation. The nightmare was over, but its impact would resonate for decades to come. 5 families would never be whole again. An entire industry would be forever changed, and the American public would be forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters walk among us, often wearing the most attractive and convincing masks. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our 3rd story. Story 3, The Leopold Files, A Criminal Mind Unleashed. The typewriter keys clicked with mechanical precision as Nathan Leopold Jr. crafted what he believed would be the perfect ransom note. His fingers, steady and calculated, betrayed no tremor of conscience as he contemplated the horror he was about to unleash upon an unsuspecting family. Chicago, 1924. A city pulsing with jazz-age decadence, had no idea that one of its most privileged sons harbored a darkness so profound it would shatter the illusion of civilized society forever. Leopold wasn't just another killer prowling the shadows of Prohibition-era America. He was something far more terrifying, a brilliant mind corrupted by its own twisted philosophy, a young man who believed himself above the moral constraints that governed ordinary mortals. With an IQ that soared above genius level and a university education that should have opened doors to greatness, Leopold instead chose to open the gates of hell. What transforms a gifted student into a cold-blooded predator? How does privilege become the breeding ground for unspeakable evil? Tonight, we descend into the fractured psyche of Nathan Leopold, where intellect married malevolence to create one of America's most chilling criminal minds. This is not merely a story of murder. It is a journey into the abyss where humanity goes to die, told through the blood-soaked pages of Leopold's own making. The screams have long since faded, but the terror remains. Welcome to the Leopold Files. Nathan Freudenthal Leopold Jr. entered this world on November 19, 1904, wrapped not in innocence but in the silken threads of Chicago's elite society. The Leopold Mansion stood like a fortress of privilege on the city's affluent South Side, its Gothic revival architecture casting long shadows that seemed to prophesy the darkness growing within its walls. Nathan Leopold Sr., a successful box manufacturer, had built an empire of corrugated dreams, never suspecting that his son would one day construct monuments of nightmare from human suffering. From his earliest moments, young Nathan exhibited an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. While other children struggled with basic arithmetic, Nathan devoured complex mathematical theorems with the hunger of a starving wolf. His mind operated like a precision instrument, dissecting information with surgical accuracy and storing it away for future use, though no one could have predicted the horrific applications that awaited. The Leopold household operated with Germanic efficiency. Nathan Sr. ruled his domestic kingdom with expectations that carved deep grooves into his son's developing psyche. Excellence wasn't encouraged, it was demanded, required, extracted like a surgeon removing a tumor. Young Nathan learned early that mediocrity was not merely disappointing. It was a form of existential failure that warranted nothing but contempt. By age 12, Nathan had mastered 15 languages, each one becoming another tool in his expanding arsenal of intellectual weapons. French rolled off his tongue like poisoned honey, German barked forth with military precision, and Latin flowed like ancient curses summoning dead gods. His teachers whispered about his abilities in faculty meetings, their voices tinged with equal parts admiration and unease. There was something unsettling about the boy's academic prowess, a coldness that seemed to emanate from his very core. The first signs of Nathan's twisted nature manifested during his early adolescence. While other boys collected baseball cards or stamps, Nathan collected birds, not to admire their beauty, but to study their anatomy through increasingly elaborate methods of dissection. His bedroom became a makeshift laboratory where feathers mixed with formaldehyde, and where the sweet stench of decay learned to dance with the antiseptic smell of scientific inquiry. Nathan's father, too consumed with his business empire to notice the warning signs, attributed his son's unusual interests to intellectual curiosity. "The boy has a scientific mind," he would tell concerned relatives, his voice carrying the pride of a man who had successfully bred genius. But genius, when left to fester in isolation, often transforms into something far more sinister. High school at University High School in Chicago became Nathan's hunting ground for intellectual superiority. He terrorized classmates not with physical violence but with a cruelty more devastating, the systematic destruction of their confidence through displays of his overwhelming intellectual dominance. He would correct teachers' mistakes with surgical precision, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty that crushed opposition like insects under a magnifying glass. During these formative years, Nathan discovered the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, and the German philosopher's concept of the Übermensch embedded itself in his developing worldview like a malignant tumor. Nietzsche's Superman theory provided Nathan with the philosophical framework he needed to justify his growing sense of superiority over what he considered lesser beings. The idea that exceptional individuals existed beyond conventional morality resonated with Nathan's already twisted psyche, giving intellectual legitimacy to impulses that should have remained buried. Nathan's relationship with his parents deteriorated as his arrogance grew. His mother, a gentle woman who had tried desperately to nurture warmth in her cold son, gradually retreated into her own world of social obligations and charitable works. She couldn't understand how the baby she had once cradled had grown into something so alien, so fundamentally disconnected from human emotion. Family dinners became exercises in polite horror, with Nathan holding court through monologues about his intellectual achievements while his parents sat like prisoners at their own table. The servants in the Leopold household whispered about young Nathan's behavior. They reported finding mutilated animals in the estate's gardens, always arranged with an artistic precision that suggested deliberate planning rather than childish cruelty. Cats would disappear from the neighborhood, only to resurface days later in Nathan's makeshift laboratory, their bodies bearing evidence of experiments that pushed the boundaries of scientific inquiry into realms of pure sadism. As Nathan entered his teenage years, his fascination with death and suffering intensified. He began frequenting morgues and hospitals, claiming academic interest while secretly reveling in the proximity to human mortality. He would spend hours staring at corpses, studying the way life's departure left behind empty shells of flesh and bone. These visits satisfied something primal in his nature, feeding a hunger that ordinary experiences could never sate. Nathan's academic achievements continued to astound his educators, but those who worked closely with him began to notice disturbing patterns. His essays on literature invariably focused on themes of death and dominance. His scientific projects always involved some form of destruction or dissection. When asked about his future aspirations, Nathan would speak with chilling matter-of-factness about his destiny to reshape society according to his superior understanding. The social dynamics of his school environment provided Nathan with opportunities to experiment with manipulation and control. He identified weaker students and subjected them to psychological torment disguised as intellectual discourse. He would challenge their most fundamental beliefs, systematically dismantling their confidence with the precision of a master craftsman destroying a carefully constructed sculpture. These exercises in cruelty provided Nathan with a sense of power that he found intoxicating. By his senior year, Nathan had developed what he considered a perfect philosophy. The world was divided between the extraordinary few who possessed the intelligence and will to shape destiny, and the ordinary masses who existed solely to serve or be consumed by their superiors. This worldview wasn't merely academic theorizing. It was the foundation upon which he would eventually build his criminal enterprises. Nathan's graduation from high school at age 15 marked not the completion of his education, but the beginning of his true learning. He had mastered the art of hiding his true nature behind a facade of academic brilliance and social propriety. Those who knew him saw only what he wanted them to see. A gifted young man destined for greatness. The monster growing within remained carefully concealed, biding its time until the perfect moment to emerge. The University of Chicago beckoned like a new hunting ground, offering fresh opportunities to explore the boundaries of human nature and moral philosophy. Nathan approached his college years with the anticipation of a predator entering virgin territory. He had spent his adolescence developing the tools and techniques he would need for his future endeavors. Now, surrounded by the intellectual elite of America's academic world, he would have the chance to put his theories into practice. But Nathan Leopold was not destined to walk this dark path alone. Somewhere in the sprawling corridors of the University of Chicago, another twisted soul was preparing to cross his path. Richard Loeb possessed his own catalog of psychological distortions and criminal fantasies. When these two damaged minds finally collided, they would create a partnership that would shock a nation and redefine society's understanding of evil itself. The stage was set for horrors beyond imagination. Nathan Leopold had spent nearly 2 decades constructing the philosophical and psychological framework for atrocity. His intellectual gifts, warped by isolation and nurtured by a sense of absolute superiority, had created something unprecedented in American criminal history. A killer who murdered not from passion or desperation, but from a cold, calculated belief in his right to determine who lived and who died. The boy who had once collected butterflies was about to begin collecting human lives. The Gothic spires of the University of Chicago pierced the sky like ancient daggers, casting shadows across a campus where 2 of America's most brilliant minds were about to forge an alliance that would forever stain the institution's reputation with blood. Nathan Leopold, now 18 and armed with degrees in philosophy and ornithology, encountered Richard Albert Loeb in the autumn of 1921, and their meeting would prove more catastrophic than any natural disaster in the city's violent history. Richard Loeb possessed everything Nathan secretly envied: effortless charisma, social grace, and the kind of magnetic personality that drew others into his orbit like moths to a flame that promised to consume them. Where Nathan's intelligence operated with mechanical precision, Richard's mind danced with creative malevolence, finding beauty in corruption and artistry in destruction. At 19, Richard had already graduated from the University of Michigan, his academic achievements overshadowed only by his growing obsession with crime and punishment. The attraction between Nathan and Richard wasn't romantic in any conventional sense. It was something far more sinister. They recognized in each other kindred spirits, fellow travelers on a journey toward moral oblivion that neither could complete alone. Nathan brought methodical planning and intellectual rationalization to their partnership, while Richard contributed imagination and the kind of reckless audacity that transforms theoretical evil into practical horror. Their initial crimes began as intellectual exercises, games designed to test their superiority over conventional morality and law enforcement. They started with petty theft, breaking into fraternity houses and stealing small items not for their monetary value but for the thrill of proving they could outwit their victims and the authorities. Each successful crime reinforced their growing belief that ordinary rules didn't apply to beings of their exceptional nature. The rush Nathan experienced during these early criminal enterprises exceeded anything he had felt during his academic triumphs. While solving complex mathematical problems had once provided intellectual satisfaction, the act of violating social boundaries and destroying others' sense of security offered something infinitely more intoxicating. Crime became his drug of choice, and Richard proved to be the perfect dealer, always ready with increasingly elaborate schemes that pushed the boundaries of acceptable risk. Their partnership evolved with frightening speed. What began as simple theft escalated to arson, as they burned down abandoned buildings and watched the flames consume structures with the same detached fascination they had once reserved for scientific experiments. The sight of destruction filled them with a sense of godlike power. They were creating and destroying with equal facility, reshaping their environment according to their twisted desires. Nathan's methodical nature complemented Richard's impulsive creativity in ways that made them exponentially more dangerous than either could have been alone. Nathan would spend weeks planning every detail of their crimes, mapping escape routes and identifying potential witnesses with the same thoroughness he had once applied to his academic research. Richard would then add elements of psychological cruelty and dramatic flair that transformed their crimes from mere violations of law into elaborate performances of evil. The young men began to view Chicago itself as their personal laboratory, its citizens reduced to test subjects in experiments designed to explore the boundaries of human suffering and social breakdown. They would follow random strangers for days, learning their routines and identifying vulnerabilities with the patience of natural predators. These surveillance exercises weren't preparation for specific crimes. They were reconnaissance missions gathering intelligence about human nature itself. Their conversations during this period revealed the depth of their mutual corruption. They would spend hours discussing philosophical justifications for murder, debating various methods of killing with the same academic detachment their professors brought to discussions of literature or history. Nathan would cite Nietzsche's Übermensch theory, while Richard would reference crime novels and detective stories, finding inspiration in fictional accounts of perfect murders. The winter of 1923 marked a turning point in their relationship and their criminal evolution. Chicago's brutal cold provided cover for increasingly violent experiments, as they began targeting individuals rather than property. Their first assault victim was a homeless man they encountered in Lincoln Park, a derelict whose disappearance would attract no attention from authorities or media. They didn't kill him, not yet, but they inflicted injuries that would serve as a preview of coming attractions. Nathan's journals from this period reveal a mind completely severed from normal human empathy. He wrote about their victims with clinical detachment, describing human suffering with the same objective language he had once used for his ornithological studies. People had become specimens to him, interesting primarily for the ways they responded to various forms of physical and psychological torture. Richard's influence pushed Nathan toward more theatrical forms of cruelty. Where Nathan might have been content with efficient violence, Richard insisted on elaborate scenarios that maximized their victims' terror and confusion. They began wearing disguises and adopting false identities, turning each crime into a performance piece with themselves as both director and star. The spring of 1924 brought warmer weather and expanded opportunities for their criminal enterprise. They had progressed beyond random violence to more sophisticated operations that required careful planning and flawless execution. Their crimes were becoming more frequent and more severe, each success building their confidence while eroding whatever remained of their connection to human morality. Nathan's family noticed changes in his behavior during this period, though they attributed his increasing coldness and erratic schedule to academic pressure. His mother observed that he seemed to derive pleasure from others' misfortunes, laughing inappropriately at news reports of accidents and tragedies. His father noted that Nathan had stopped discussing his future plans, becoming evasive whenever questioned about his career aspirations or personal goals. The partnership between Nathan and Richard had evolved into something resembling a marriage made in hell, complete with its own twisted rituals and shared secrets that bound them together more tightly than any conventional relationship could. They had created their own moral universe where conventional ethics held no sway, where the only sin was getting caught and the only virtue was the successful exercise of their superior will over inferior beings. Their criminal activities during the spring of 1924 included a series of increasingly sophisticated frauds and thefts that demonstrated their growing expertise in deception and manipulation. They would pose as representatives of various organizations, gaining access to homes and businesses where they would steal not just valuables but personal information that could be used for future crimes. These operations required them to study their victims' psychology, learning to exploit trust and vulnerability with scientific precision. Nathan's academic performance began to suffer as his criminal activities consumed more of his mental energy. Professors who had once praised his intellectual gifts now expressed concern about his deteriorating focus and increasingly disturbing written work. His essays on literature and philosophy revealed a mind fixated on themes of death, dominance, and the breakdown of social order. The thrill of their criminal successes was no longer enough to satisfy their growing hunger for transgression. Nathan and Richard had pushed beyond the boundaries of ordinary crime into territories that few human beings had ever explored. They had become something new and terrible, a fusion of intellectual brilliance and moral corruption that represented evolution in reverse, the devolution of human consciousness into something predatory and alien. By the late spring of 1924, their conversations had turned increasingly toward the ultimate transgression, murder. Not killing in passion or desperation, but murder as art form, as the ultimate expression of their superiority over the moral constraints that governed ordinary mortals. They began planning what they believed would be the perfect crime, an act so flawlessly executed that it would cement their reputations as criminal masterminds while proving once and for all their transcendence of conventional morality. The selection of their victim would require careful consideration. They needed someone whose death would create maximum impact while providing minimum risk of detection. Nathan approached this decision with the same methodical analysis he had once applied to academic problems, creating detailed profiles of potential targets while Richard contributed creative insights about methods and motivations. Their victim would not be chosen at random. Every detail of the crime would be planned with scientific precision, from the initial approach to the final disposal of evidence. This would not be a mere killing. It would be a masterpiece of criminal artistry that would demonstrate their intellectual superiority while satisfying their deepest psychological needs. The partnership that had begun with petty theft was about to culminate in an act so shocking that it would forever change American society's understanding of evil itself. Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building the skills and rationalization they would need to cross the final boundary between criminality and ultimate horror. The perfect crime was about to begin. May 21st, 1924, dawned with deceptive tranquility over Chicago's affluent Kenwood neighborhood, the morning sun filtering through oak leaves that whispered secrets they couldn't yet comprehend. 14-year-old Robert Bobby Franks walked home from the Harvard School for Boys, his tennis racket swinging carelessly at his side, completely unaware that death was stalking him in the form of a rented Willis Knight sedan containing 2 of the most dangerous predators ever to prowl American streets. Nathan Leopold sat behind the wheel with surgical composure, his hands steady on the leather steering wheel despite the magnitude of what they were about to unleash. Months of meticulous planning had led to this moment, the culmination of their criminal evolution from petty theft to the ultimate transgression. Richard Loeb occupied the passenger seat, his charming smile masking anticipation that bordered on sexual excitement. They had chosen their victim with the same careful deliberation a collector might use when selecting a rare butterfly for his display case. Bobby Franks represented everything Nathan and Richard had learned to despise about conventional society. He was young, innocent, and protected by the same social privilege that had once sheltered their own childhoods before corruption consumed their souls. His wealthy parents had provided him with every advantage, never suspecting that their son's very prosperity would mark him for destruction at the hands of two monsters who had transformed privilege into predation. The initial approach unfolded with practiced precision. Richard called out to Bobby with the kind of friendly familiarity that would have seemed natural to anyone observing from a distance. "Hey, Bobby, want a ride home?" The words carried no hint of the horror they were about to unleash, delivered with the same casual warmth Richard might have used to invite a friend to lunch. Bobby's response was equally innocent, a grateful acceptance that sealed his fate with the finality of a death warrant. As Bobby climbed into the back seat of the sedan, Nathan and Richard exchanged glances that communicated volumes without words. Years of criminal partnership had created between them a form of telepathic understanding that eliminated the need for verbal coordination. They had rehearsed this scenario countless times in their minds, considering every variable and contingency with the thoroughness of military strategists planning a campaign. The murder itself unfolded with shocking brutality. Nathan continued driving while Richard turned toward their victim with a heavy chisel clutched in his hand, a tool chosen not just for its effectiveness but for the intimate nature of the violence it would require. The first blow caught Bobby completely off guard, the metal cracking against his skull with a sound that would echo in Nathan's memory for the rest of his life. Bobby's screams filled the sedan's interior, high-pitched and desperate, the kind of sounds that should have triggered protective instincts in any normal human being. Instead, Nathan found himself analyzing the acoustic properties of terror while maintaining perfect control of the vehicle. His scientific mind cataloged every detail: the way fear affected vocal pitch, the rhythm of panic-induced breathing, the specific timbre of a child's voice when confronted with imminent death. Richard continued his assault with methodical persistence, each blow of the chisel designed to maximize suffering while ensuring eventual death. Blood splattered across the sedan's upholstery, creating patterns that Richard would later describe as beautiful in their abstract complexity. The killing wasn't quick. They had deliberately chosen methods that would prolong Bobby's agony, feeding their psychological need to witness the complete breakdown of human dignity. The drive toward their predetermined disposal site in the remote Wolf Lake area became a mobile torture chamber. Bobby's consciousness flickered in and out like a candle guttering in wind, his broken body convulsing with each bump in the road. Nathan navigated Chicago's streets with the same calm precision he had once used during academic examinations. His mind compartmentalized in ways that allowed him to function normally while participating in unspeakable atrocity. As they approached the desolate marshlands that would serve as Bobby's grave, Nathan experienced what he later described as a moment of transcendental clarity. The act of murder had elevated him beyond ordinary human limitations, confirming his long-held belief in his superiority over conventional morality. He had crossed the ultimate boundary and found not guilt or remorse but a sense of completion that bordered on religious ecstasy. The disposal of Bobby's body required the same methodical approach they had brought to the killing itself. They had scouted the location weeks earlier, identifying a culvert system that would keep the corpse hidden while allowing water flow to accelerate decomposition. Nathan's scientific background proved invaluable in calculating the chemical processes that would eliminate physical evidence, while Richard contributed creative touches designed to confuse any eventual investigation. Richard's decision to pour hydrochloric acid over Bobby's face represented more than mere evidence destruction. It was an act of artistic vandalism that transformed their victim from a recognizable human being into an abstract sculpture of dissolved flesh and bone. The acid hissed and bubbled as it ate through tissue, creating a spectacle that both men found mesmerizing in its chemical precision. With Bobby's body concealed in the culvert, Nathan and Richard returned to Chicago to begin the next phase of their criminal masterpiece, the ransom demand. They had planned this element with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized the murder itself, crafting a scheme designed to extract maximum psychological torture from Bobby's parents while minimizing their own risk of detection. The ransom note they composed revealed the depth of their psychological sophistication. Every word had been chosen for maximum impact, designed to create hope while guaranteeing despair. They demanded $10,000, a substantial sum but not so large as to seem impossible, while providing detailed instructions that would force Jacob Franks into a degrading dance of submission to his son's killers. Nathan typed the ransom letter on his Hammond typewriter, each keystroke deliberate and measured, while Richard composed the psychological elements that would transform simple extortion into elaborate torture. They were no longer merely demanding money. They were orchestrating a symphony of human suffering that would continue long after Bobby's death, extending their victim's agony to encompass his entire family. The phone call to the Franks household represented the culmination of months of criminal evolution. Nathan's voice carried no trace of uncertainty or guilt as he delivered instructions to Bobby's father, speaking with the same authoritative tone he had once used during academic presentations. He had become something beyond conventional human categories, a creature that wore human form while harboring consciousness utterly alien to normal emotional experience. Jacob Frank's desperate compliance with their demands provided Nathan and Richard with satisfaction that exceeded even the thrill of murder. They had reduced a successful businessman to a puppet dancing to their commands, forcing him to degrade himself in pursuit of a son who was already beyond all possible rescue. The psychological dimension of their crime was proving even more rewarding than the physical violence. Their instructions sent Jacob Franks racing across Chicago on a treasure hunt designed to maximize his suffering while entertaining his son's killers. They watched from a distance as he followed their directions with pathetic precision, each step taking him further from any possibility of saving Bobby while feeding their sense of godlike control over human destiny. The discovery of Bobby's body by a maintenance worker ended the ransom charade but marked the beginning of a new phase in Nathan and Richard's criminal experience. The investigation that followed would test their intellectual superiority against the combined resources of law enforcement, creating the kind of high-stakes game they had always craved. Chicago police responded to the murder with unprecedented intensity, recognizing that the brutal killing of a child from a prominent family threatened the very foundations of social order. The investigation team assembled by the authorities represented the finest detective minds in the Midwest, experienced professionals who had solved hundreds of murders through methodical police work and psychological insight. Nathan and Richard initially reveled in their adversarial relationship with law enforcement, viewing the investigation as a form of intellectual chess match that would prove their superiority over conventional minds. They followed newspaper coverage of the case with the obsessive attention of fans following their favorite sporting event, analyzing every detail for signs of investigative progress or confusion. The scientific analysis of evidence recovered from the crime scene began to create the first cracks in their perfect crime scenario. Nathan's ornithological expertise, which had once seemed like an obscure academic pursuit, became a liability when investigators discovered rare bird feathers near Bobby's body that could only have come from someone with specialized knowledge of avian species. Richard's psychological need for recognition began to undermine their careful planning. He couldn't resist making subtle references to their crime during social conversations, dropping hints that demonstrated his superior knowledge while maintaining plausible deniability. These verbal exhibitions satisfied his ego while creating a trail of evidence that experienced investigators would eventually recognize and pursue. The net was closing around them with scientific inevitability, each piece of evidence adding weight to the growing case against Chicago's most privileged killers. Nathan and Richard had believed their intellectual gifts would protect them from detection, but they were about to learn that intelligence without wisdom often leads to destruction, and that their perfect crime was about to become their perfect downfall. The first crack in Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb's carefully constructed facade appeared not through brilliant detective work, but through Richard's compulsive need for recognition. Unable to resist the psychological satisfaction of superior knowledge, he began dropping subtle hints about the Franks case during conversations with friends and acquaintances, his ego demanding acknowledgement of his criminal masterpiece even at the cost of personal safety. Detective Sergeant William Shoemaker of the Chicago Police Department possessed the kind of methodical intelligence that Nathan and Richard had foolishly underestimated. While they had planned for dramatic confrontations with inferior minds, they had failed to account for the grinding persistence of professional investigation. Shoemaker approached the Franks case with the same scientific methodology that Nathan had once applied to his academic work, collecting evidence with patient thoroughness rather than relying on inspired flashes of insight. The discovery of Nathan's eyeglasses near Bobby Frank's body provided the investigation with its first concrete lead. The glasses had slipped from Nathan's pocket during the body disposal, a minor oversight that would prove catastrophic to their carefully orchestrated scheme. The prescription lenses were distinctive enough that optometrists could trace them to their original purchaser, creating a direct connection between Nathan Leopold and the crime scene. When confronted about his glasses, Nathan initially maintained the cool composure that had served him throughout his criminal career. He explained that he had lost the glasses during a bird-watching expedition in the same general area where Bobby's body was found, a story that seemed plausible given his well-known interest in ornithology. However, the explanation contained logical flaws that experienced investigators recognized immediately. Detective Shoemaker's interrogation technique proved more sophisticated than Nathan had anticipated. Rather than employing dramatic confrontation tactics, Shoemaker used a methodical approach that gradually exposed inconsistencies in Nathan's story through careful questioning and patient analysis. Each interview session revealed new contradictions, creating a web of lies that became increasingly difficult to maintain. Richard's psychological profile made him more vulnerable to interrogation pressure than his intellectually superior partner. His need for attention and recognition created vulnerabilities that skilled investigators could exploit, while his impulsive nature made him less capable of maintaining consistent deception under sustained questioning. The charming personality that had once been his greatest asset became a liability when subjected to professional scrutiny. The typewriter evidence provided investigators with their strongest connection to the crime. Nathan's Hammond typewriter had produced the ransom note with distinctive characteristics that forensic experts could match to other documents he had typed. The scientific analysis of typewritten documents was still a relatively new forensic technique, but it proved devastatingly effective in linking Nathan directly to the extortion attempt. State's Attorney Robert Crowe assembled a prosecution team that understood the magnitude of the case they were handling. The brutal murder of Bobby Franks had shocked Chicago's social elite, destroying their illusion of safety and privilege while exposing the potential for evil within their own ranks. The prosecution of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb would require legal expertise combined with psychological insight to present a case that could secure convictions against defendants who possessed significant financial resources and social connections. Nathan's initial confidence began to erode as the weight of evidence accumulated against them. His scientific mind, trained to analyze data objectively, couldn't ignore the mathematical certainty of their eventual conviction. The careful planning that had characterized their criminal partnership was revealing itself as fundamentally flawed, based on assumptions about law enforcement competence that proved tragically incorrect. The confession process unfolded with psychological complexity that reflected the twisted nature of their partnership. Nathan attempted to maintain intellectual control by providing detailed accounts of their crimes, describing the murder of Bobby Franks with clinical precision while emphasizing the sophisticated planning that had preceded their actions. His confession became a form of academic lecture, delivered with the same authoritative tone he had once used during university presentations. Richard's confession revealed different psychological motivations, focusing on the excitement and adventure of their criminal activities rather than the intellectual framework Nathan had constructed to justify their actions. He described their crimes with enthusiasm that shocked investigators, displaying genuine pride in their accomplishments while showing no evidence of remorse for their victims' suffering. The media coverage of their arrest and confession created a national sensation that exceeded anything Chicago had experienced since the Great Fire. Newspapers across the country featured headline stories about the millionaire killers who had murdered a child for entertainment, their privileged backgrounds making their crimes seem even more shocking than if they had been committed by ordinary criminals. The legal strategy developed by their defense team represented one of the most sophisticated criminal defense efforts in American legal history. Clarence Darrow, widely regarded as the nation's most brilliant defense attorney, accepted the case despite his personal revulsion at their crimes. Darrow's strategy focused not on proving innocence, the evidence made that impossible, but on saving their lives by demonstrating that their actions resulted from psychological abnormalities rather than simple evil. The psychiatric evaluation process revealed the depth of psychological damage that had transformed two privileged young men into killers. Dr. William Healy and Dr. William White conducted extensive examinations that documented the complex mental processes underlying their criminal behavior. Their findings painted a portrait of minds that had developed along fundamentally abnormal lines, creating personalities capable of viewing murder as an intellectual exercise rather than a moral catastrophe. Nathan's psychological profile revealed a personality structure built around grandiose self-perception and complete lack of empathy for others. His intellectual gifts had been corrupted by isolation and privilege, creating a worldview that divided humanity into superior beings like himself and inferior creatures whose lives held no intrinsic value. The murder of Bobby Franks represented the logical conclusion of philosophical premises that had been developing throughout his adolescence. Richard's psychological evaluation disclosed different but complementary abnormalities. His personality was structured around the need for excitement and recognition, with criminal activity providing the kind of intense stimulation that conventional achievements could never match. His relationship with Nathan had provided the intellectual framework necessary to transform his impulsive tendencies into systematic criminal behavior. The trial itself became a theatrical event that attracted international attention. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators drawn by morbid curiosity about the psychological mechanisms that had created such monsters. Legal experts, psychiatrists, and social commentators analyzed every detail of the proceedings, seeking to understand how such crimes could occur within the context of advanced civilization. Clarence Darrow's defense presentation represented a masterpiece of legal oratory and psychological insight. Rather than attempting to excuse their crimes, Darrow forced the court to confront the complex factors that had shaped their development, arguing that society itself bore partial responsibility for creating conditions that allowed such psychological abnormalities to flourish unchecked. The prosecution's case relied on the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the particular cruelty with which Bobby Franks had been murdered. State's Attorney Crowe painted Nathan and Richard as coldly calculating killers who had murdered an innocent child for their own entertainment, deserving of death for crimes that violated every principle of human decency. Judge John Caverly faced the most difficult decision of his judicial career when he sentenced Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb to life imprisonment plus 99 years rather than death. His reasoning reflected the complex legal and moral questions raised by their case, acknowledging their guilt while recognizing the psychological factors that had contributed to their criminal development. The prison years that followed revealed the ultimate consequences of their criminal partnership. Richard Loeb was killed in 1936 by a fellow inmate in what was officially ruled self-defense, his charming personality finally encountering someone immune to manipulation. His death represented a form of poetic justice that satisfied those who believed their original sentences had been too lenient. Nathan Leopold survived nearly 34 years in prison, eventually earning parole in 1958 through demonstrated rehabilitation and scholarly achievement. His post-prison life in Puerto Rico represented a genuine attempt at redemption, though the shadow of Bobby Franks' murder followed him until his death in 1971. The Leopold and Loeb case fundamentally changed American society's understanding of criminal psychology and the potential for evil within privileged circumstances. Their crimes shattered illusions about the relationship between education, social position, and moral behavior, while demonstrating that intelligence without empathy could produce monsters more dangerous than any conventional criminal. The legacy of their partnership extends beyond their individual crimes to encompass broader questions about human nature and social responsibility. Their case established precedents in criminal law and forensic psychology that continue to influence legal proceedings today, while their story serves as a permanent reminder of the thin lines separating civilization from barbarity. Bobby Franks' murder stands as a testament to innocence destroyed by intellectual arrogance and moral corruption. His death was not merely a criminal act but a violation of the fundamental trust that allows society to function, a betrayal of every value that separates human beings from predatory animals. The horror of what Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb accomplished together continues to resonate nearly a century after their crime. They proved that evil requires no external motivation beyond the desire to exercise power over others, and that the greatest monsters often emerge not from poverty or ignorance but from privilege corrupted by psychological abnormality. Their story ends not with redemption or understanding but with the cold recognition that some human minds can develop along lines so fundamentally twisted that they become threats to the entire social order. The Leopold files remain permanently open, a reminder that the capacity for absolute evil exists within the same species that produces saints and heroes, waiting only for the right combination of circumstances to emerge and claim new victims. The screams have faded, but the questions remain. In a world where intelligence and privilege offer no guarantee of moral behavior, how do we identify and prevent the creation of future monsters? The answer lies not in these pages, but in the vigilance of a society that learned, through the blood of Bobby Franks, that evil wears many faces, and sometimes the most dangerous are those that smile back at us from positions of trust and authority. The case is closed, but the horror endures forever. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our fourth story. Story 4. The Coast-to Coast Killer, Tommy Lynn Sells. When darkness falls across America's highways, most travelers see empty roads leading home. But for 22 years, one predator saw something entirely different, hunting grounds stretching from coast to coast, where innocence would meet its most brutal end. Tommy Lynn Sells didn't just kill. He obliterated lives with a savagery that defied comprehension, leaving behind a trail of shattered families and unanswered screams that echoed through the night. This is the story of America's most prolific serial killer, a ghost who moved through shadows, striking without warning, vanishing without trace, turning the American dream into an unending nightmare. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement of Interstate 35, but inside the stolen pickup truck, a different kind of heat burned. Tommy Lynn Sells gripped the steering wheel with hands that had already claimed more lives than most people could fathom, his cold gray eyes scanning the horizon for his next opportunity. It was July 13, 2000, and the monster America didn't yet know existed was about to write another horrific chapter in his blood-soaked autobiography. Evil, they say, isn't born. It's forged in the fires of abandonment, brutality, and systematic destruction of the human soul. For Tommy Lynn Sells, that forge began working overtime from his very first breath. Born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, he entered a world that seemed determined to twist him into something monstrous. His mother, a troubled woman named Nina Sells, was barely equipped to care for herself, let alone nurture a child who would require extraordinary intervention to avoid the darkness already gathering around his cradle. The family structure, if it could be called that, crumbled before Tommy could even walk. His biological father vanished into the ether of irresponsibility, leaving behind only genetic material and a void where guidance should have been. Nina, overwhelmed and unstable, passed Tommy between relatives like an unwanted burden, each placement more damaging than the last. By age 2, the boy who would become America's most prolific killer was already learning that love was conditional, safety was temporary, and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The abuse began early and escalated with terrifying consistency. Foster homes became chambers of horror where predatory adults saw opportunity in Tommy's vulnerability. He was sexually assaulted repeatedly, beaten with methodical cruelty, and subjected to psychological torment that would have broken most children completely. But instead of breaking, something far more dangerous occurred. Tommy began to adapt, to learn, to internalize the lessons his tormentors were teaching him about power, control, and the expendability of human life. School became another battleground where Tommy's rage manifested in increasingly violent outbursts. Teachers described him as a child possessed by something dark and uncontrollable. He tortured animals with calculated precision, finding satisfaction in their helpless suffering. Classmates learned to fear the boy with the dead eyes and hair-trigger temper. By age 8, Tommy was already displaying the classic triad of future serial killers: bedwetting that persisted far beyond normal age, obsessive fire setting, and animal cruelty that bordered on ritualistic. The fire incidents were particularly telling. Tommy didn't just start fires randomly. He studied them, fed them, watched with fascination as flames consumed everything in their path. Neighbors would later recall the unsettling sight of young Tommy standing motionless as emergency crews battled blazes he had ignited. His face illuminated by the hellish glow, wearing an expression of pure satisfaction. Fire became his first teacher in the art of destruction, showing him how quickly something solid and permanent could be reduced to ash and memory. When Tommy turned 10, his mother made a decision that would prove catastrophic for dozens of future victims. Unable to handle her increasingly violent and disturbed son, she abandoned him permanently, driving away one morning and never looking back. The psychological impact of this ultimate rejection cannot be overstated. For Tommy, it confirmed what the abuse had already taught him: that people existed only to cause pain or be discarded, that attachment led to agony, and that the only constant in life was betrayal. The state juvenile system swallowed Tommy whole, shuttling him through a series of group homes and detention facilities where his violence escalated exponentially. Staff members reported incidents of extreme aggression that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Tommy would explode into frenzied attacks on weaker residents, displaying a level of brutality that shocked even hardened juvenile corrections officers. These weren't childish tantrums. They were calculated displays of dominance that left his victims traumatized and fearful. During one particularly brutal incident at a group home in Texas, 14-year-old Tommy attacked a younger boy with a broken bottle, carving deep gashes across the child's face while whispering threats about what would happen if he screamed. The attack was stopped only when two counselors physically restrained Tommy, who continued struggling and snarling like a rabid animal even after being subdued. The victim required 43 stitches and carried both physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. By his 15th birthday, Tommy had mastered the art of manipulation that would serve him throughout his killing career. He learned to present different faces to different people, becoming whatever they needed him to be long enough to gain their trust or access. With authority figures, he could be contrite and reformed, speaking in therapeutic language about his troubled past and his determination to change. With potential victims, he was charming and helpful, offering assistance that masked predatory intent. The transition from institutional violence to street predation occurred when Tommy aged out of the juvenile system at 18. Suddenly free but completely unprepared for legitimate adult life, he gravitated toward the margins of society where his particular skill set was not just accepted but valued. He fell in with criminal networks that operated along the interstate highway system, learning the routes and rhythms that would later serve as his hunting grounds. Drugs became both escape and catalyst for Tommy's evolving pathology. Methamphetamines amplified his natural aggression, while cocaine fueled paranoid delusions that everyone was either prey or threat. Alcohol loosened what few inhibitions remained, creating a chemical cocktail that transformed an already dangerous individual into something approaching pure evil. Under the influence, Tommy's violence became more extreme, more creative, more personally satisfying. His first confirmed kill occurred in 1985, though investigators believe he had been murdering for years before that. The victim was Melody Wirtz, a 28-year-old mother of two, who made the fatal mistake of offering a ride to a seemingly harmless young man standing beside a broken-down car. Tommy repaid her kindness by strangling her with her own shoelaces, but not before subjecting her to hours of sexual torture that demonstrated a level of sadistic creativity that would become his signature. The murder of Melody Wirtz revealed several key elements of what would become Tommy's established pattern. He targeted vulnerable individuals who were isolated and unlikely to be missed immediately. He used their own possessions as weapons, creating a twisted intimacy between killer and victim. Most chillingly, he took time with his kills, savoring the process of destruction rather than simply ending lives efficiently. Following the Wirtz murder, Tommy disappeared into the vast network of American highways like a ghost merging with shadows. He had discovered his true calling, not just killing, but the perfect lifestyle to support unlimited killing. The interstate system provided anonymity, mobility, and an endless supply of potential victims. Truck stops, rest areas, and small towns became his shopping centers, each one offering new opportunities for violence. The next few years saw Tommy perfecting his craft while leaving behind a trail of bodies that law enforcement agencies couldn't connect. He killed in different states using different methods, ensuring that patterns remained invisible to investigators working within jurisdictional boundaries. A strangled prostitute in Nevada, a stabbed hitchhiker in Arizona, a bludgeoned store clerk in New Mexico. Each murder appeared to be an isolated incident rather than part of a coordinated campaign of terror. Tommy's intelligence, often underestimated due to his rough appearance and criminal background, became his greatest asset. He studied police procedures, learning how investigations worked and how to avoid leaving evidence. He researched forensic science, understanding what traces could betray him and how to eliminate them. He monitored news coverage of his crimes, adjusting his methods whenever authorities seemed to be making connections. The psychological evolution during this period was as disturbing as the physical violence. Tommy began developing elaborate fantasies about his victims, creating detailed mental scenarios that he would play out during the murders. He started keeping trophies, pieces of jewelry, clothing items, photographs, that allowed him to relive the killings whenever the urge struck. These rituals became increasingly important to his psychological satisfaction, transforming murder from impulse to ceremony. As the 1980s progressed into the 1990s, Tommy's confidence grew along with his body count. He began taking greater risks, lingering longer at crime scenes, interacting more extensively with potential witnesses. This wasn't carelessness. It was the behavior of a predator who had never been seriously challenged and believed himself to be invincible. He saw law enforcement as a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine threat, an attitude that would persist until his final catastrophic mistake. The decade of the 1990s represented Tommy's peak operational period, when his methods reached their most refined and his violence achieved its most extreme expressions. He had become exactly what his childhood traumas had shaped him to be, a perfect predator whose only purpose was the systematic destruction of human life. The highways of America had given birth to a monster, and that monster was just getting started. The American highway system, built to connect communities and enable dreams, became Tommy Lindsell's personal hunting preserve throughout the 1990s. Every mile marker represented potential death, every rest stop a possible crime scene, every small town an opportunity for unspeakable horror. As his confidence grew and his methods became more refined, Tommy transformed from an opportunistic killer into something far more terrifying, a calculating predator who viewed the entire continental United States as his territory. Interstate 35 held special significance in Tommy's twisted geography of violence. Stretching from Minnesota to Texas, this crucial transportation artery provided him with access to countless victims while offering perfect escape routes when heat from law enforcement grew too intense. He knew every truck stop, every lonely stretch of road, every small town where a stranger could appear and disappear without attracting attention. Most importantly, he understood the rhythms of highway life, when workers changed shifts, when travelers were most vulnerable, when screams would go unheard in the darkness. The murder of Haley McCone in 1987 demonstrated Tommy's evolving sophistication as a killer. The 13-year-old girl was walking home from a friend's house in Lexington, Kentucky, when Tommy spotted her from his stolen vehicle. Instead of impulsively attacking, he followed her for several blocks, studying her route and timing. When she took a shortcut through a wooded area, Tommy was already waiting. The sexual assault and strangulation that followed lasted over 3 hours, during which Tommy experimented with different methods of inflicting pain and terror. What made the McCone murder particularly significant was not just its brutality, but Tommy's behavior afterward. Instead of fleeing immediately, he spent additional time positioning the body in a degrading manner, arranging her clothing and possessions in ways designed to maximize the psychological impact on whoever discovered her. He was no longer just killing. He was crafting crime scenes like macabre art installations, each one a statement about his power and his victim's worthlessness. The investigation into Haley's murder revealed several crucial elements that would become Tommy's signature. He had taken trophies from the scene, her school ring and a small cross necklace, which investigators initially dismissed as robbery motives. More disturbing were the bite marks found on her body, created not during the assault but after death, suggesting a level of necrophilic behavior that indicated severe psychological deterioration. Most chillingly, he had disabled the security cameras after the initial attack, suggesting he had studied the store's layout and systems before striking. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was premeditated torture carried out with military precision. Tommy's ability to blend into highway culture provided perfect camouflage for his activities. He could pass for a long-haul trucker, a construction worker moving between job sites, or a drifter seeking odd jobs. His appearance was aggressively ordinary: medium height, brown hair, unremarkable features that witnesses struggled to describe accurately. He cultivated this anonymity deliberately, understanding that memorable characteristics led to identifications and arrests. The summer of 1989 saw Tommy's most concentrated killing spree, with 7 confirmed murders across 5 states in just 2 months. Each killing demonstrated increasing violence and decreasing intervals between attacks, suggesting that the psychological pressure driving his behavior was intensifying. Victims included a family of 4 killed in their rural Montana home, 2 prostitutes murdered in separate incidents in Nevada, and an elderly man beaten to death at a rest stop in Colorado. The Montana family massacre represented a new level of horror in Tommy's career. The Bentley family, Father Robert, Mother Susan, and children Michael, 12, and Sarah, 8, were selected apparently at random when Tommy's stolen pickup truck developed engine trouble near their isolated farmhouse. Robert Bentley made the fatal decision to offer assistance to the stranded motorist, inviting Tommy inside while calling a tow truck. What followed was 18 hours of systematic torture that defied human comprehension. Tommy bound the family members in their living room and proceeded to demonstrate various methods of inflicting pain, using each family member as an example for the others. He began with the father, breaking his fingers one by one while forcing the wife and children to watch. When Robert lost consciousness, Tommy revived him with cold water and began working on his toes. The psychological torture was as methodical as the physical abuse. Tommy forced family members to choose which of their loved ones would suffer next, creating impossible decisions that added emotional agony to physical pain. He made the children watch as he sexually assaulted their mother, then forced the parents to witness unspeakable acts perpetrated against their children. The entire ordeal was conducted with Tommy providing running commentary about his techniques and his victims' reactions. When Tommy finally tired of the game, he killed each family member individually using different methods. Robert was strangled with a telephone cord. Susan was beaten to death with a hammer. Michael was drowned in the kitchen sink, and Sarah was suffocated with a pillow. But even death didn't end their suffering. Tommy spent several more hours mutilating the bodies, arranging them in degrading positions throughout the house, and taking photographs as trophies. The Bentley crime scene shocked even veteran investigators accustomed to extreme violence. The level of destruction was so complete that initial responders assumed they were dealing with a satanic cult or terrorist attack rather than a single individual. The methodical nature of the torture, combined with evidence of ritualistic behavior, suggested a killer who had moved beyond mere psychopathy into something approaching pure evil. Tommy's behavior following the Bentley massacre revealed another disturbing aspect of his psychology. He didn't flee immediately but remained in the area for 3 days, visiting local bars and restaurants while police discovered the bodies and began their investigation. He seemed to derive additional satisfaction from being present during the community's horror and confusion, positioning himself as a concerned citizen shocked by the terrible tragedy that had befallen such a nice family. This pattern of remaining near crime scenes became increasingly common in Tommy's later killings. He would often book a motel room in the vicinity of his murders, watching news coverage and listening to local radio reports about the investigations. Sometimes he would even approach investigators directly, offering to help with information about suspicious individuals he had supposedly seen in the area. This behavior demonstrated both supreme confidence in his ability to avoid detection and a pathological need to experience the aftermath of his violence. The early 1990s brought technological advances that should have made Tommy's activities more difficult, but he adapted with characteristic intelligence. Security cameras became more common, but Tommy learned to identify and avoid them or disable them when necessary. DNA testing began appearing in major investigations, but Tommy refined his evidence elimination procedures to stay ahead of forensic capabilities. Most importantly, computer databases began allowing law enforcement agencies to share information across jurisdictional boundaries, But Tommy's kills remained too scattered and varied for patterns to emerge clearly. The murder of Jessica Levry in 1992 exemplified Tommy's evolution as a predator. The 16-year-old was hitchhiking near Spokane, Washington, when Tommy offered her a ride. Instead of killing her immediately, he drove for 2 days, during which he gradually revealed his true nature through increasingly disturbing conversations and minor acts of violence. By the time Jessica realized the danger she was in, Tommy had transported her hundreds of miles from any possible help. The psychological torture began long before the physical assault. Tommy described previous murders in graphic detail, explaining techniques he had used and reactions he had observed. He showed Jessica photographs from his trophy collection, forcing her to look at images of previous victims in various states of decomposition and mutilation. Most sadistically, he made her participate in selecting the methods he would use to kill her, framing it as giving her control over her own death. When Tommy finally stopped driving, he had chosen a location in the remote wilderness of Idaho where screams would echo unheard through empty canyons. The killing that followed lasted 3 days, during which Tommy systematically broke every major bone in Jessica's body while keeping her alive through crude medical intervention. He had studied enough anatomy to understand how to inflict maximum pain without causing immediate death, transforming murder into an extended scientific experiment in human suffering. The Jessica Levry crime scene provided investigators with their most detailed look yet at Tommy's methods and psychology. He had carved symbols into nearby trees, created elaborate arrangements of rocks and branches around the body, and left behind detailed written notes describing his actions and motivations. For the first time, law enforcement began to understand that they were dealing with something far beyond a typical serial killer. This was an individual who viewed murder as artistic expression and human suffering as raw material for his creativity. As 1992 ended and 1993 began, Tommy's body count had reached staggering proportions, though law enforcement agencies remained largely unaware of the scope of his activities. Operating across multiple jurisdictions using various identities, he had become a ghost haunting America's highways, striking without warning and vanishing without trace. But ghosts, no matter how clever, eventually leave evidence of their presence. And Tommy Lindsell's was about to discover that even the most perfect predator could make fatal mistakes. The mid-1990s marked Tommy Lindsell's transformation from prolific killer to something approaching a force of nature, a human hurricane of violence that swept across the American landscape, leaving devastation in its wake. His confidence had evolved into arrogance, his methods had reached horrifying sophistication, and his appetite for brutality seemed to grow with each kill. During this period, Tommy would commit some of his most depraved acts while simultaneously making the mistakes that would eventually lead to his downfall. The year 1993 opened with the savage murder of the Martinez family in Del Rio, Texas, a crime that would later become central to Tommy's eventual capture. Josephine Martinez, a 34-year-old mother of 3, had been struggling financially since her husband's death in a construction accident. When Tommy appeared at her door claiming to be a handyman looking for work, she saw an answer to her prayers. Instead, she had invited the devil himself into her home. Tommy spent 3 days with the Martinez family, during which he carefully studied their routines, security measures, and vulnerabilities. He helped repair their fence, fixed a leaky faucet, and even played with the children, 10-year-old Carlos, 8-year-old Maria, and 6-year-old Miguel. To neighbors, he appeared to be exactly what Josephine claimed, a helpful drifter who had found temporary work with a family in need. But Tommy was actually conducting reconnaissance, mapping out the most efficient way to destroy every life in the household. The attack began on a Tuesday night after the children had gone to bed and Josephine was washing dishes. Tommy struck her from behind with a cast-iron skillet, fracturing her skull but not killing her immediately. As she lay semi-conscious on the kitchen floor, Tommy proceeded to awaken each child individually, bringing them to witness their mother's suffering before subjecting them to their own torture. What followed was a night of systematic horror that pushed the boundaries of human evil. Tommy had brought with him a collection of tools, knives, pliers, a small blowtorch, and various restraints that suggested extensive premeditation. He used these instruments to create a symphony of agony that lasted until dawn, with each family member serving as both victim and audience for the other's suffering. Carlos, the eldest, was forced to watch as Tommy systematically broke his mother's fingers and toes, punctuating each snap with questions about hidden valuables or secret savings. When the boy tried to protect his family, Tommy responded by heating a kitchen knife with the stove burner and pressing it against Carlos's chest, creating a wound that would later help investigators identify the killer's signature methods. Maria's torture was perhaps the most sadistic, as Tommy seemed to derive particular satisfaction from terrorizing the young girl. He carved shallow cuts across her arms and legs in geometric patterns, explaining to her siblings that he was decorating her for a special purpose. The psychological torment was as methodical as the physical abuse, with Tommy forcing Maria to describe her own pain and beg for mercy that would never come. 6-year-old Miguel, the youngest, suffered perhaps the worst fate of all. Tommy used the child as leverage against the other family members, threatening increasingly severe punishments if they didn't comply with his demands. When Josephine finally lost consciousness from her injuries, Tommy demonstrated his depravity by carrying out those threats in excruciating detail. By dawn, the Martinez home had been transformed into a slaughterhouse that would haunt investigators for decades. Tommy's signature was evident throughout the scene. The methodical arrangement of bodies, the ritualistic nature of the wounds, and the carefully placed trophies taken from each victim. But more than evidence of his crime, the scene represented the complete moral bankruptcy of a human being who had abandoned every trace of humanity in pursuit of sadistic pleasure. The Martinez investigation proved challenging because Tommy had been meticulous about evidence elimination. He had worn gloves throughout the attack, used bleach to clean potential DNA sources, and removed anything that might have contained fingerprints. More problematically, several neighbors reported seeing the helpful handyman but provided descriptions so generic they could have matched thousands of individuals. Following the Martinez massacre, Tommy's killing pattern became even more erratic and geographically scattered. He seemed to understand that the intensity of that crime would generate significant law enforcement attention, so he modified his methods to avoid creating similar scenes. His next several murders were quick, efficient killings that bore little resemblance to his previous elaborate torture sessions. The death of Patricia Johnson in Phoenix, Arizona, exemplified this new approach. The 42-year-old nurse was walking to her car after a late shift at the hospital when Tommy approached her in the parking garage. Instead of his usual extended torture routine, he simply struck her with a tire iron, dragged her behind a concrete pillar, and strangled her with her own stethoscope. The entire attack lasted less than 5 minutes, leaving little evidence and fewer witnesses. But Tommy's psychological needs couldn't be satisfied by quick kills indefinitely. The elaborate rituals and extended torture sessions weren't just criminal behavior, they were essential components of his identity and self-worth. By late 1993, he was experiencing what criminal psychologists would later identify as withdrawal symptoms, a psychological craving for the complex emotional and sensory experiences provided by his more elaborate murders. The killing of the Dardine family in Illinois marked Tommy's return to extended torture sessions, but with even more disturbing innovations. Russell and Julie Dardine, along with their 3-year-old son Peter and Julie's newborn daughter, were selected apparently at random when Tommy's car broke down near their rural home. Russell's offer to call a tow truck initiated a sequence of events that would produce one of the most horrific crime scenes in American criminal history. Tommy's approach to the Dardine family revealed new dimensions of his psychological pathology. Instead of immediately revealing his violent intentions, he spent several hours with the family, eating dinner, watching television, and interacting normally with their children. This extended period of normalcy served multiple purposes. It allowed him to study his victims' personalities and relationships while building psychological pressure that would enhance his eventual satisfaction. When Tommy finally revealed his true nature, he did so gradually, introducing violence in small increments that allowed him to savor his victims' growing terror. He began by tying up Russell under the pretense of preventing him from interfering while Tommy robbed the house. Then he bound Julie, explaining that cooperation would ensure her children's safety. Finally, he restrained the children, by which point the adults understood they were dealing with something far beyond ordinary criminal behavior. The torture session that followed lasted 14 hours and included innovations that demonstrated Tommy's continuing evolution as a sadistic predator. He had brought with him a portable cassette recorder, which he used to capture his victims' screams and pleas for mercy. These recordings, he explained, would allow him to relive the experience whenever he desired, transforming each murder into an eternal source of satisfaction. Tommy's treatment of the Dardine children revealed the complete absence of normal human emotional responses. 3-year-old Peter became a tool for controlling the adults, with Tommy threatening increasingly severe punishments if his parents didn't comply with various demands. The infant daughter was used in ways that defied both description and comprehension, serving as evidence of Tommy's complete psychological disintegration. The crime scene that investigators discovered 2 days later represented a new pinnacle of human evil. Tommy had arranged the bodies in a configuration that mimicked a family dinner, with each victim positioned as if they were still participating in normal domestic activities. The psychological impact on responding officers was so severe that several required extended counseling to continue their law enforcement careers. More disturbing than the physical evidence were the written notes Tommy had left throughout the house, describing his actions and motivations in clinical detail. These documents provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a serial killer at the peak of his operational sophistication, revealing thought processes that combined intelligence, creativity, and complete moral vacancy in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature. The Dardine investigation produced several crucial pieces of evidence that would eventually contribute to Tommy's identification and capture. Forensic analysts recovered fibers from his clothing, partial fingerprints despite his precautions, and most importantly, saliva samples from cigarette butts he had left at the scene. But in 1993, these items were simply stored as evidence while investigators pursued more traditional leads that led nowhere. As 1994 progressed, Tommy's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. The psychological pressure of maintaining his killing schedule while avoiding law enforcement detection was beginning to manifest in ways that made him more visible and vulnerable. He began taking greater risks, lingering longer at crime scenes, and making contact with potential witnesses who might later identify him. The murder of Sarah Mitchell in Albuquerque, New Mexico, demonstrated both Tommy's escalating violence and his deteriorating judgment. The 19-year-old college student was studying alone in the university library when Tommy approached her during closing time, claiming to be a security guard who needed to escort her to her car. Instead of leading her to safety, he guided her to an isolated area of the campus where he had already prepared restraints and torture implements. Sarah's murder marked the beginning of what investigators would later call Tommy's endgame phase, a period when his psychological needs began overriding his survival instincts. He spent 6 hours with Sarah, during which he not only tortured and killed her, but also created extensive documentation of his actions through photographs and written descriptions. More dangerously, he allowed Sarah to remain conscious and coherent long enough for her to observe and potentially remember crucial identifying details. When campus security discovered Sarah's body the next morning, they found a crime scene that was both more brutal and more revealing than Tommy's previous work. He had been careless with evidence elimination, leaving behind fingerprints, DNA samples, and physical traces that connected him to other unsolved murders across the Southwest. But perhaps most significantly, he had left behind one of his cassette recordings, providing investigators with audio documentation of his methods and psychology. The recording from Sarah Mitchell's murder became a crucial tool in understanding Tommy's operational methods and psychological motivations. Criminal psychologists who analyzed the audio identified speech patterns, regional accent markers, and behavioral indicators that helped create the first accurate psychological profile of the unknown killer. For the first time, law enforcement agencies began to understand that they were dealing with a single individual rather than multiple unrelated criminals. As 1994 ended and 1995 began, Tommy Lynn Sells had become America's most prolific active serial killer, though law enforcement agencies still didn't know his identity or the full scope of his activities. His body count had reached numbers that strained credibility. His methods had achieved levels of sophistication that challenged investigative capabilities, and his appetite for violence showed no signs of diminishing. But the very success of his killing career was creating pressures that would ultimately lead to his downfall. The highways of America had nurtured a monster, but monsters, no matter how clever or careful, eventually make mistakes. and Tommy Linsells was about to make the mistake that would end his reign of terror and bring justice for the dozens of innocent lives he had destroyed in his relentless pursuit of sadistic satisfaction. December 31st, 1999, seemed like any other night for Tommy Linsells as he cruised the dark highways of South Texas, hunting for his next victim. The millennium was ending, but his appetite for violence remained as insatiable as ever. 22 years of killing had refined his methods to near perfection, and his confidence had grown to the point where he believed himself truly unstoppable. But on this New Year's Eve, Tommy would make the single catastrophic error that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end. The Harris family home in Del Rio, Texas, stood quietly against the winter night, its occupants unaware that death itself was approaching their doorstep. Tommy had been watching the house for 3 days, studying the family's routines and identifying vulnerabilities. Terry and Julie Harris were out of town visiting relatives, leaving their 10-year-old daughter Katie alone with family friend Crystal Searles, a 13-year-old girl who was spending the night as a sleepover companion. Tommy's plan was methodical and brutal, developed through decades of experience in home invasion murders. He would enter through a window he had already identified as unsecured, neutralize both girls quickly to avoid screams that might alert neighbors, then spend the remainder of the night indulging in the ritualistic torture that had become his signature. It should have been another perfect crime, another pair of victims to add to his staggering body count. But Tommy Linsells was about to discover that even the most experienced predator could underestimate his prey. The attack began at 2:17 a.m. when Tommy pried open the bedroom window and slipped inside like a shadow given human form. Katie Harris was sleeping peacefully in her own bed while Crystal Searles occupied a sleeping bag on the floor nearby. Tommy's initial assault was swift and savage. He struck Katie multiple times with a 12-inch hunting knife, inflicting wounds that would prove fatal within minutes. The young girl's life ended in confused terror, her final moments consumed by pain she was too young to understand. Crystal Searles awoke to the nightmare of watching her best friend being murdered, but instead of paralyzed by shock, she reacted with remarkable presence of mind. As Tommy turned his attention toward her, knife raised for another fatal assault, Crystal rolled away from the attacking blade and scrambled toward the bedroom door. Tommy's swing missed her vital organs but carved a devastating wound across her throat, opening her neck from ear to ear in a gash that should have killed her instantly. What Tommy didn't anticipate was Crystal's extraordinary will to survive. Despite massive blood loss and injuries that would have incapacitated most adults, the 13-year-old managed to escape the bedroom and flee through the house toward the front door. Tommy pursued her, confident that she would collapse from blood loss before reaching safety, but Crystal's determination exceeded all reasonable expectations. She burst through the front door and ran across the street to a neighbor's house, pounding on their door while blood streamed from her throat wound. The neighbors, awakened by her desperate knocking, initially thought they were looking at the victim of a car accident. But Crystal managed to communicate enough information about the attack to prompt them to call 911 while Tommy fled into the night, believing his young victim would die before providing any useful information to investigators. Tommy had made several crucial errors during the Harris home invasion, mistakes that would ultimately lead to his identification and capture. Most significantly, he had underestimated Crystal Searles' resilience and ability to survive injuries that would have killed most people. Additionally, he had been careless about evidence elimination, leaving behind fingerprints, DNA samples, and physical traces that connected him to previous unsolved murders. But perhaps most fatally, Tommy had allowed himself to be clearly observed by a surviving victim who possessed both the intelligence to remember important details and the courage to cooperate with law enforcement. Crystal Searles would prove to be the witness who finally brought America's most prolific serial killer to justice. Emergency responders who arrived at the scene were astonished to find Crystal alive and conscious despite injuries that should have been immediately fatal. The knife wound across her throat had missed her carotid artery by millimeters, and though she had lost massive amounts of blood, her vital organs remained intact. More importantly, she had maintained enough cognitive function to provide investigators with a detailed description of her attacker. The description Crystal provided was the most accurate and complete profile law enforcement had ever obtained of the unknown killer who had been terrorizing the Southwest for decades. She described Tommy's height, weight, hair color, facial features, distinctive scars, and even specific details about his clothing and mannerisms. Most crucially, she had observed his vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck with distinctive damage to the front bumper, providing investigators with their first concrete lead in decades of investigation. Working with a forensic sketch artist, Crystal helped create a composite drawing that captured Tommy's appearance with remarkable accuracy. The sketch was distributed to law enforcement agencies across Texas and surrounding states, generating immediate recognition from multiple investigators who had encountered similar descriptions in unsolved murder cases. For the first time, the scattered pieces of Tommy's killing spree began forming a coherent pattern. Detective John Smith of the Val Verde County Sheriff's Department took personal charge of the investigation, recognizing that the Harris home invasion might be the key to solving numerous cold cases that had plagued his region for years. Smith had been investigating suspicious murders along the Interstate 35 corridor since the early 1990s, developing a theory that a single killer was responsible for crimes spanning multiple states and jurisdictions. The forensic evidence collected from the Harris crime scene provided unprecedented insight into Tommy's methods and identity. DNA samples recovered from blood evidence were immediately entered into the Cody's database, generating matches with unsolved murders in 7 different states. Fingerprints lifted from the bedroom window matched partial prints found at crime scenes dating back to 1987, confirming Smith's theory about a serial killer operating across jurisdictional boundaries. More significantly, the evidence revealed Tommy's true identity for the first time. His fingerprints matched records from his juvenile detention stays in the 1980s, providing investigators with a real name, criminal history, and photograph. Tommy Lynn Sells was no longer a nameless specter haunting America's highways. He was an identified suspect with a documented history of violence and a clear trail of evidence linking him to dozens of unsolved murders. The manhunt that followed Crystal Searle's survival was unlike anything law enforcement had previously mounted for a serial killer. Multi-state task forces coordinated their efforts using advanced computer databases and communication systems that had been unavailable during Tommy's earlier killing sprees. His photograph was distributed to every police department, sheriff's office, and highway patrol unit from California to Florida, creating an unprecedented dragnet design to capture America's most wanted fugitive. Tommy's reaction to the failed Harris home invasion revealed both his awareness of the danger he now faced and his psychological inability to stop killing. Instead of fleeing to Mexico or another country where he might have avoided capture, he continued operating in the same geographic region, seemingly compelled to maintain his killing schedule despite the massive law enforcement presence searching for him. On January 2nd, 2000, just 2 days after the Harris attack, Tommy struck again. Mary Perez, a 28-year-old convenience store clerk in Eagle Pass, Texas, became his next victim when she was working alone during the early morning shift. Tommy's attack on Mary demonstrated both his desperation and his deteriorating judgment. The store was located on a busy highway with multiple security cameras, and his assault occurred during daylight hours when discovery was virtually inevitable. The murder of Mary Perez provided investigators with their most detailed forensic evidence yet. Security cameras captured clear images of Tommy entering and leaving the store, while DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene definitively linked him to previous murders across multiple states. More importantly, witness testimony from customers who had encountered Tommy shortly before the attack provided law enforcement with crucial information about his current appearance, vehicle, and possible whereabouts. Detective Smith coordinated the investigation with methodical precision, understanding that Tommy's psychological profile suggested he would continue killing until captured or killed. Resources were concentrated in the border region between Texas and Mexico, where Tommy had committed his most recent crimes and seemed to feel most comfortable operating. Roadblocks were established at strategic locations, while undercover officers monitored truck stops, motels, and other locations where transient criminals typically sought shelter. The breakthrough came on January 4, 2000, when Tommy was spotted at a truck stop near Uvalde, Texas, by an off-duty highway patrol officer who recognized him from the widely distributed wanted posters. Instead of attempting immediate arrest, the officer called for backup while maintaining surveillance, understanding that Tommy's violent history made him extremely dangerous when cornered. The arrest operation that followed was carefully orchestrated to minimize the risk of additional violence. SWAT teams surrounded the truck stop while negotiators attempted to communicate with Tommy, who had barricaded himself inside a stolen vehicle when he realized he had been identified. For nearly 3 hours, law enforcement officers tried to convince him to surrender peacefully, but Tommy's response was characteristically defiant and threatening. The standoff ended when Tommy attempted to escape by ramming his vehicle through a police barricade, forcing officers to disable his truck with gunfire. Even then, Tommy continued resisting arrest, requiring multiple officers to subdue him physically. His final words before being handcuffed were a profanity-laced threat against law enforcement officers and a promise that his killing spree was far from over. Tommy's arrest sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country as investigators began connecting his confirmed identity to unsolved murders spanning more than 2 decades. The scope of his crimes exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history, with potential victim counts reaching numbers that strained credibility. Each new piece of evidence revealed additional murders, creating an investigative challenge of unprecedented complexity. The interrogation process revealed Tommy's complete lack of remorse for his crimes, while providing crucial information about murders that had never been officially connected to him. He displayed a disturbing pride in his accomplishments, describing killings in graphic detail while expressing frustration that law enforcement had underestimated his capabilities for so many years. His confessions ultimately linked him to murders in 12 different states, with victim counts reaching well into double digits. Tommy's trial began in September 2000, with prosecutors seeking the death penalty for the murder of Katie Harris. The evidence against him was overwhelming: DNA samples, fingerprints, witness testimony, and his own detailed confessions created an airtight case that his defense attorneys could only challenge on procedural grounds. More significantly, Crystal Searles testified against her attacker with remarkable courage and composure, providing the jury with first-hand testimony about Tommy's savage nature. The psychological evaluation conducted during Tommy's trial revealed an individual who had progressed beyond typical serial killer pathology into something approaching complete moral vacancy. Expert witnesses described him as one of the most dangerous criminals ever studied, possessing intelligence, ruthlessness, and sadistic creativity in combinations that made him uniquely lethal. His lack of empathy was so complete that evaluators questioned whether he could still be considered fully human in any meaningful sense. On November 8, 2000, Tommy Lynn Sells was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death for the killing of Katie Harris. The verdict was met with relief from law enforcement officers who had spent decades pursuing him, but also with sobering recognition that his capture had come far too late for the dozens of innocent victims whose lives he had destroyed. Additional charges in other states would follow, but the Texas conviction ensured that Tommy would face ultimate justice for his crimes. Tommy's time on death row was marked by continued attempts to manipulate the legal system and generate publicity for himself. He granted numerous interviews to journalists and crime writers, using these opportunities to boast about murders he had committed while taunting the families of his victims. His behavior demonstrated that even facing execution, he remained fundamentally unchanged, a predator whose only satisfaction came from causing pain to others. The appeals process stretched for years as Tommy's attorneys challenged various aspects of his conviction and sentencing. But the evidence against him was so overwhelming and his crimes so heinous that these efforts proved futile. Courts at every level affirmed his conviction and death sentence, clearing the way for the justice that had been delayed for far too long. On April 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas, bringing an end to one of the most prolific killing careers in American criminal history. His final statement was brief and showed no remorse for his victims or their families. Even in his final moments, Tommy remained defiant and unrepentant, dying as he had lived, without conscience, empathy, or humanity. The legacy of Tommy Lynn Sells extends far beyond his individual crimes to encompass fundamental changes in how law enforcement agencies approach serial killer investigations. His case demonstrated the critical importance of interjurisdictional cooperation, advanced forensic techniques, and victim advocacy programs. Most significantly, it highlighted the extraordinary courage of survivors like Crystal Searles, whose bravery ensured that justice would finally prevail. Today, Crystal Searles lives a private life away from the public attention that followed her survival of Tommy's attack. The physical scars from her injuries have faded with time, but her psychological recovery continues with the support of counselors and advocates who understand the unique trauma experienced by survivors of extreme violence. Her courage in testifying against Tommy and cooperating with law enforcement likely prevented additional murders and provided closure for families whose loved ones had been killed by America's most prolific serial killer. The highways of America continue to carry millions of travelers each year, most of them unaware of the monster who once prowled those same roads in search of victims. But the law enforcement officers who patrol those highways remember Tommy Linsells and the lessons his case taught about the importance of vigilance, cooperation, and the relentless pursuit of justice. His story serves as both a warning about the evil that can hide in plain sight and a testament to the courage of those who refuse to let that evil prevail. In the end, Tommy Linsells was exactly what his childhood traumas had shaped him to become. A perfect predator whose only purpose was the destruction of innocent life. But he was also something else. A reminder that even the most successful monsters eventually face justice, and that the courage of a single survivor can bring down the most dangerous criminal. The coast-to-coast killer's reign of terror lasted 22 years, but justice, though delayed, ultimately prevailed. If you're still awake, let's move on to our final story. Story 5. The Co-Ed Killer, Edmund Kemper's Reign of Terror. When darkness falls over Santa Cruz, California, mothers still whisper warnings to their daughters. They speak of a giant who once stalked these very streets, a brilliant predator whose towering frame cast shadows longer than his victims' final screams. Edmund Emil Kemper III didn't just kill. He orchestrated symphonies of terror that would forever stain the 1970s with blood. Standing 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, this gentle giant's soft-spoken demeanor masked the mind of a calculating executioner who turned human hunting into an art form. His victims never saw death approaching until it was already wrapping its cold fingers around their throats. College co-eds, hitchhiking with the naive trust of youth, climbed willingly into his sedan, unaware they were entering a mobile slaughterhouse. What followed were crimes so methodical, so grotesquely intimate, that even hardened detectives would wake screaming decades later. This is the story of America's most intelligent serial killer, a man whose IQ soared above genius level while his humanity plummeted into an abyss so deep that light itself seemed to flee. Kemper didn't just take lives. He collected them, studied them, and violated them in ways that redefined the boundaries of human evil. His confessions would chill investigators to their very core, revealing a predator who treated murder like a doctoral thesis in depravity. Welcome to a journey through the twisted corridors of a mind where brilliance and brutality dance together in perfect, terrifying harmony. This is the Edmund Kemper story, where every victim's final moment became his moment of ecstasy, and where death was never just an ending, but a grotesque beginning. The first scream that truly mattered to Edmund Emil Kemper III wasn't one of his victims. It was his own, echoing through the suffocating dysfunction of his childhood home. Born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Edmund entered a world already twisted by the venomous relationship between his parents, Edmund Jr. and Clarnell Strandberg. What should have been a sanctuary became a laboratory for creating the perfect predator. Clarnell Strandberg was a woman whose words cut deeper than any blade Edmund would later wield. Standing barely 5 feet tall, she wielded her tongue like a weapon of mass destruction, particularly against her towering son who would grow to dwarf her physically while remaining emotionally chained to her cruelty. Her alcoholism wasn't just a disease. It was fuel for the furnace of rage that burned within their home's walls. "You're just like your father," she would snarl, her voice dripping with the kind of contempt that carves permanent scars into a developing psyche. Worthless, stupid, and too big for your own good. These weren't mere insults. They were psychological bullets fired at point-blank range into the mind of a child who was already showing disturbing signs of detachment from reality. Edmund's father, a World War II veteran, had fled the toxic atmosphere early in the boy's life, leaving behind a son who would spend decades seeking to prove his mother wrong through increasingly violent means. The abandonment wasn't just emotional. It was a complete severance that left Edmund adrift in an ocean of maternal hatred with no lighthouse to guide him toward normal human development. By age 10, Edmund's fascination with death had already begun to manifest in ways that should have sent every adult around him into panic mode. While other children played with toy soldiers, Edmund was conducting elaborate funeral services for family pets, pets that had mysteriously begun dying with suspicious frequency. His younger sisters would later recall finding their beloved cats buried in the backyard, arranged in positions that suggested ritualistic behavior rather than simple childhood grief. The young Edmund's bedroom became a shrine to death and domination. He collected roadkill with the dedication of a scholar, studying decomposition with scientific precision. His dresser drawers contained carefully preserved animal parts, each labeled and cataloged like specimens in a twisted museum. When questioned about these grisly collections, Edmund would simply smile, that same unsettling smile that would later charm his human victims into their final, fatal mistake. His intellectual capabilities were undeniable, even terrifying in their scope. Psychological evaluations would later reveal an IQ that soared into the genius range, but this brilliance was being channeled through increasingly dark pathways. Edmund devoured books about serial killers, torture methods, and criminal psychology with the same voracious appetite other children reserved for comic books and adventure stories. The warning signs weren't subtle. They were screaming sirens that everyone chose to ignore. Edmund began displaying what psychiatrists would later recognize as the classic triad of sociopathic behavior: bedwetting well past the normal age, obsessive fire-starting, and animal cruelty that escalated from simple killing to elaborate torture rituals that lasted for hours. His relationship with his mother continued to deteriorate into something that transcended normal family dysfunction and entered the realm of psychological warfare. Clarnell's criticisms became more creative, more specifically designed to wound. She would mock his height, calling him a freak of nature, and suggesting that no woman would ever want him. These attacks on his masculinity and desirability would later manifest in his choice of young, attractive female victims, women who represented everything his mother insisted he could never have. At age 13, Edmund committed his first documented act of violence that hinted at the monster gestating within. His family cat, a gentle creature named Trouble, became the target of Edmund's escalating rage. But this wasn't a moment of childhood anger. It was a calculated execution that demonstrated a level of planning and brutality that chilled anyone who learned the details. Edmund lured Trouble into the basement, where he had prepared what could only be described as a torture chamber. Using techniques he had gleaned from his extensive reading about medieval punishment methods, he slowly dismembered the living animal while it was still conscious. The process took over 2 hours, during which Edmund reportedly maintained complete emotional detachment, even taking notes about the animal's responses to various forms of mutilation. When his mother discovered Trouble's remains, Edmund's response was perhaps more disturbing than the act itself. He showed no remorse, no shame, no recognition that he had crossed a fundamental boundary of human behavior. Instead, he calmly explained his actions as scientific research and expressed disappointment that the cat had died before he could complete his experiments. This incident marked the beginning of what psychologists would later identify as Edmund's complete disconnection from empathy. The neural pathways that should have developed to create emotional bonds with other living beings had instead become highways for sadistic impulses that grew stronger with each passing day. His academic performance, paradoxically, began to soar during this same period. Teachers praised his intelligence, his articulate communication skills, and his seemingly mature understanding of complex subjects. What they didn't realize was that Edmund was using the classroom as a hunting ground for information, learning about human psychology, anatomy, and behavior patterns that he would later exploit with deadly precision. The teenage Edmund began to physically intimidate those around him as his body continued its relentless growth. By age 15, he had reached his full height of 6 feet 9 inches, towering over classmates and teachers like a Gothic cathedral of flesh and bone. His hands, which would later become instruments of death, were already massive enough to completely encircle a human throat with room to spare. It was during his 15th year that Edmund's fantasies took a decidedly homicidal turn. No longer content with animal victims, he began stalking neighborhood children, following them home from school and learning their routines with the dedication of a military strategist. His journals from this period, discovered years later, revealed detailed plans for kidnapping, torture, and murder that were sophisticated enough to have been written by an experienced criminal rather than a teenager. The relationship with his mother reached its breaking point when Clarnell made a decision that would seal the fate of countless future victims. Unable to control her increasingly disturbing son, and perhaps finally recognizing the genuine danger he represented, she arranged for Edmund to spend time with his paternal grandparents on their remote ranch in North Fork, California. Edmund and Guy Kemper were hardworking, religious people who believed that farm life and strict discipline could straighten out any troubled youth. They had no way of understanding that they weren't dealing with a typical problem child. They were harboring a predator who had already moved far beyond the possibility of redemption. The isolation of the ranch provided Edmund with something he had never had before: privacy. Miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by endless wilderness, he finally had the space to let his darkest impulses run free without the constraints of civilization holding him back. His grandparents, busy with the demanding work of running a cattle ranch, gave him long periods of unsupervised time that he used to perfect his killing techniques on the abundant wildlife. But animals were no longer enough. The fantasies that had sustained him throughout his troubled childhood were demanding more realistic fulfillment. Edmund began to view his elderly grandparents not as family members who were trying to help him, but as potential victims whose deaths could provide him with the ultimate thrill: his first human kills. The stage was set for a massacre that would announce Edmund Kemper's arrival as one of America's most dangerous predators. The quiet ranch that was supposed to be his salvation was about to become the launching pad for a career in murder that would terrorize an entire state and redefine the public's understanding of what a serial killer could be. On the morning of August 27, 1964, 15-year-old Edmund Kemper would cross the final line that separates the disturbed from the damned, transforming from a troubled youth into a cold-blooded killer whose appetite for death would only grow with each victim he claimed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the California ranch as 15-year-old Edmund Kemper sat cleaning his grandfather's .22 caliber rifle. August 27, 1964, had dawned like any other day in the isolated wilderness of North Fork, but by sunset, 2 people would be dead, and America would have gained one of its most notorious serial killers. Edmund's massive frame was hunched over the weapon with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. His grandmother, Maud Kemper, moved about the kitchen preparing breakfast, completely unaware that she was sharing her final morning with the grandson she had tried so desperately to help. The irony was suffocating. The same hands that had lovingly prepared countless meals for Edmund were now in the crosshairs of a predator who saw her not as family, but as prey. The killing began with a single gunshot that shattered the morning stillness like glass exploding under pressure. Edmund had approached his 66-year-old grandmother from behind as she sat at the kitchen table working on a children's book she was writing. The rifle's barrel was pressed so close to the back of her head that powder burns would later mark the entry wound, a detail that revealed the intimate nature of this first murder. But Edmund's first kill wasn't driven by explosive rage or momentary insanity. According to his later confessions, delivered with the same casual tone one might use to describe a grocery shopping trip, he simply wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma. The clinical detachment in that statement would become Edmund's signature: murder as intellectual curiosity rather than emotional outburst. Maud Kemper died instantly, her blood spattering across the pages of the innocent children's story she would never finish. Edmund later described watching the life drain from her eyes as educational, noting how different human death was from the animal kills he had practiced on for years. The psychological pleasure he derived from this moment would become the template for every future murder: death as personal entertainment. The sound of the gunshot echoed across the ranch, and Edmund knew he had perhaps minutes before his grandfather returned from his morning chores. Rather than panic or attempt to flee, Edmund made a decision that revealed the calculating nature of his psychopathy. He would eliminate the witness and complete what he had started. Guy Kemper, 72 years old and weathered by decades of hard ranch work, walked through the front door expecting to find his wife and grandson preparing for another quiet day. Instead, he found himself staring down the barrel of his own rifle, held steady in the massive hands of the boy he had tried to mentor. "I just wondered how it would feel to shoot Grandpa," Edmund would later explain to police investigators with the same emotional detachment others might use to describe swatting a fly. The second shot was fired at point-blank range, destroying the old man's chest and sending him crashing backward into the doorframe. Guy Kemper died knowing that his own kindness had somehow fostered the creation of a monster. What happened next revealed Edmund's natural instinct for self-preservation and manipulation, traits that would make him far more dangerous than impulsive killers who acted without planning. Rather than fleeing the scene or attempting to dispose of the bodies, Edmund calmly walked to the telephone and called his mother, Clarnell. The conversation that followed would haunt investigators for decades. Edmund's voice remained steady, almost conversational, as he informed his mother that he had just murdered both of his grandparents. When Clarnell demanded to know why, Edmund's response was chilling in its simplicity. "I just wanted to see what it felt like." Then came the manipulation that proved Edmund was already thinking several steps ahead. He instructed his mother to contact the police and told her exactly what to say. He had already constructed a narrative that portrayed the killings as a moment of temporary insanity brought on by his troubled upbringing. A story designed to generate sympathy rather than the life sentence his actions truly deserved. By the time sheriff's deputies arrived at the ranch, Edmund had arranged the scene with theatrical precision. He sat calmly on the front porch, the rifle laid carefully at his feet, his hands visible and non-threatening. His demeanor was that of a confused, remorseful child rather than a cold-blooded double murderer. Even seasoned law enforcement officers found themselves feeling sorry for the troubled youth, who seemed so genuinely disturbed by his own actions. The psychological evaluation that followed Edmund's arrest revealed a mind that operated on a level far beyond his 15 years. Dr. Joel Fort, one of California's leading psychiatrists, conducted extensive interviews with the young killer and emerged with conclusions that should have terrified anyone who heard them. Edmund wasn't suffering from temporary insanity or adolescent psychological disturbance. He was a fully formed psychopath whose capacity for violence had only begun to manifest. "He is a danger to society," Dr. Fort wrote in his official report. "His potential for violence is enormous, and his lack of genuine remorse suggests that these killings were not aberrations but previews of future behavior." The recommendation was clear: Edmund Kemper should never be released into society. But the juvenile justice system of 1964 wasn't equipped to handle a killer of Edmund's sophistication. Despite the brutal nature of his crimes and the professional warnings about his dangerousness, Edmund was sentenced to be held at a Atascadero State Hospital until his 21st birthday, a maximum of 6 years for taking 2 lives. Atascadero was supposed to be a treatment facility, but for Edmund, it became a graduate school in criminal psychology. Rather than receiving therapy that might have contained his violent impulses, Edmund spent his incarceration studying the other patients, learning from their mistakes, analyzing what had led to their capture, and developing strategies to avoid their failures. His intelligence made him a favorite among the hospital staff, who saw in him a young man who was genuinely interested in understanding and overcoming his psychological problems. What they didn't realize was that Edmund was conducting his own research project, using his fellow patients as unwilling test subjects for his theories about human behavior and criminal psychology. Edmund's case files from Atascadero reveal a young man who had learned to say all the right things to convince authorities that he was making progress toward rehabilitation. He spoke eloquently about his remorse, his desire to lead a normal life, and his understanding of what had gone wrong in his thinking. Every word was carefully calculated to create the impression of genuine psychological healing. Meanwhile, his private journals told a different story entirely. Edmund continued to fantasize about murder, rape, and torture with increasing sophistication. His plans became more detailed, his methods more refined. He studied the case files of other patients, learning from their techniques while identifying the mistakes that had led to their capture. The hospital's psychological testing revealed Edmund's extraordinary intelligence. His IQ tested consistently in the upper ranges of genius level. But rather than using this gift for positive purposes, Edmund was channeling his intellectual capabilities toward perfecting his ability to kill without getting caught. He read voraciously, devouring texts on forensic science, criminal investigation techniques, and police procedures. By age 18, Edmund had grown even more imposing physically. His 6'9" frame had filled out with muscle, and his hands had developed the crushing strength that would later prove fatal to his victims. Hospital staff noted that other patients seemed instinctively afraid of Edmund, giving him a wide berth even when he was displaying his most charming, friendly demeanor. The psychological evaluations conducted as Edmund's release date approached painted a picture of a young man who had successfully overcome his violent tendencies through therapy and medication. Dr. Donald Lund, the psychiatrist who would later recommend Edmund's release, was impressed by his apparent insight into his past actions and his articulated plans for leading a productive life. What Dr. Lund couldn't see was that Edmund had become a master manipulator who understood exactly what mental health professionals wanted to hear. Every session was a performance, carefully scripted to advance Edmund toward his ultimate goal: freedom to hunt human prey on a scale that would dwarf his teenage crimes. Edmund's preparation for release was methodical and thorough. He had spent years studying police procedures, learning about forensic evidence, and developing techniques for avoiding detection. He understood that his size and unusual background would make him memorable, so he practiced blending into crowds and adopting different personas depending on the situation. Most importantly, Edmund had identified his preferred victim type during his years of incarceration. The young female staff members at Atascadero had provided him with ample opportunity to study the behavior patterns of college-aged women. He learned their mannerisms, their vulnerabilities, and most critically, their tendency to trust authority figures and seemingly harmless individuals. On his 21st birthday, December 18, 1969, Edmund Emil Kemper III walked out of Atascadero State Hospital a free man. The officials who released him believed they had successfully rehabilitated a troubled youth who had committed an isolated act of violence during a moment of psychological crisis. The reality was far more terrifying. They had just unleashed a predator whose intellectual capabilities were matched only by his complete lack of human empathy. Edmund's years of confinement hadn't cured him. They had transformed him into the perfect killing machine, equipped with all the knowledge and skills necessary to avoid the mistakes that trapped lesser criminals. The stage was now set for a reign of terror that would claim 10 more lives and establish Edmund Kemper as one of the most intelligent and dangerous serial killers in American criminal history. The quiet teenager who had killed his grandparents, to see what it felt like, was about to become the co-ed killer, a predator whose crimes would redefine society's understanding of human evil. The year 1972 dawned with Edmund Kemper finally tasting the freedom he had craved throughout his 6-year incarceration. Now 23 years old and standing like a monolithic tower of calculated menace, Edmund had returned to Santa Cruz, California, a college town that would soon become his personal hunting preserve. The sleepy coastal community, with its abundance of young female college students and culture of casual hitchhiking, represented the perfect ecosystem for a predator of Edmund's particular appetites. Edmund's physical presence was impossible to ignore. At 6 feet 9 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, he moved through crowds like a gentle giant, his soft-spoken demeanor and articulate speech patterns creating a persona that was both memorable and disarming. But those who looked closely might have noticed something predatory in the way his eyes tracked young women, cataloging their movements with the precision of a hunter studying prey. His living situation provided the perfect cover for his emerging criminal activities. Edmund had moved back in with his mother, Clarnell, who was now working as an administrative assistant at the University of California, Santa Cruz. The same woman whose psychological abuse had helped create the monster now unknowingly provided him with access to student directories, class schedules, and detailed information about the daily routines of hundreds of potential victims. The relationship between mother and son had evolved into something even more toxic than their earlier dysfunction. Clarnell's alcoholism had intensified during Edmund's incarceration, and her verbal attacks had become more vicious and personal. She delighted in emasculating her giant son, particularly regarding his relationships with women, telling him repeatedly that no decent girl would ever want anything to do with a freak like you. These psychological assaults were feeding directly into Edmund's growing obsession with proving his mother wrong through increasingly violent means. Every young woman who smiled at him, every casual conversation with a female stranger, became ammunition in his private war against Clarnell's predictions. But Edmund's definition of proving her wrong involved scenarios that would have horrified any normal person. Edmund's preparation for what he privately called his hunting season was methodical and comprehensive. He had purchased a yellow 1969 Ford Galaxy, a vehicle large enough to accommodate his massive frame while appearing non-threatening to potential hitchhikers. The car's spacious interior had been modified with supplies that transformed it into a mobile torture chamber. Plastic sheeting, rope, knives, and a handgun, all carefully concealed but easily accessible. His knowledge of police procedures, gained during his years of study at Atascadero, had taught him the importance of appearing normal and trustworthy. Edmund began frequenting the jury room, a popular bar near the university where off-duty police officers gathered to unwind. His charming personality and apparent interest in law enforcement made him a popular figure among the local cops, who had no idea they were socializing with a predator who was planning to terrorize their community. The hitchhiking culture of early 1970s California provided Edmund with a virtually unlimited supply of potential victims. Young women thought nothing of accepting rides from strangers, particularly from someone who appeared as harmless and articulate as Edmund. His size, rather than being intimidating, was often seen as protective. Surely no one would attempt to harm a woman when she was with such an imposing male companion. Edmund's first known victim of his adult killing spree was 18-year-old Mary Ann Pesci, a freshman at Fresno State College. On May 7, 1972, Mary Ann was hitchhiking near Berkeley when Edmund's yellow Ford pulled to the curb. The young woman, pretty and trusting, climbed into the passenger seat with no idea that she was entering a carefully prepared death trap. What followed was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that Edmund had perfected during his years of incarceration. He engaged Mary and in friendly conversation, asking about her studies and her plans for the weekend. His voice remained calm and reassuring even as he drove farther and farther from her intended destination. By the time Mary Ann realized something was wrong, Edmund had already driven to a remote wooded area where her screams would never be heard. The details of what Edmund did to Mary Ann Pesci during her final hours were so horrific that even experienced homicide detectives struggled to maintain their professional composure while reviewing the evidence. Edmund later confessed to stabbing her multiple times, but the wounds were inflicted with surgical precision designed to maximize pain while keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. But the killing itself was only the beginning of Edmund's grotesque ritual. After Mary Ann had died, Edmund engaged in acts of necrophilia that demonstrated a level of sexual pathology that placed him among the most disturbed criminals in recorded history. He later described these posthumous violations with the same clinical detachment he had used to discuss his grandparents' murders, noting specific details about decomposition and rigor mortis as if he were conducting a scientific experiment. Edmund's treatment of Mary Ann's body after death revealed another disturbing aspect of his psychology: his need to maintain control and possession over his victims even after they could no longer suffer. He dismembered her corpse with tools he had specifically purchased for this purpose, keeping certain body parts as trophies while disposing of others in locations scattered throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains. The disappearance of Mary Ann Pesci barely registered with local law enforcement, who assumed she had simply decided to drop out of school and return home without notifying anyone. The casual attitude toward missing persons cases, particularly involving young women who were assumed to be free spirits, provided Edmund with the perfect cover for his escalating criminal activities. 3 weeks later, Edmund struck again. 18-year-old Anita Lucchesa, a fellow Fresno State student and Mary Ann's close friend, was hitchhiking near the same area where her friend had disappeared. Edmund's yellow Ford appeared like a recurring nightmare, and once again, a trusting young woman climbed willingly into the vehicle that would become her tomb. Anita's murder followed the same horrific pattern as Mary Ann's, but with refinements that showed Edmund was learning from each killing. He had developed techniques for maintaining psychological control over his victims that prolonged their terror while minimizing the risk of attracting attention. His methods of restraint had become more sophisticated, and his approach to disposal had become more efficient. The parallel disappearances of the two friends finally caught the attention of law enforcement, But the investigation that followed was hampered by Edmund's careful planning and his growing knowledge of police procedures. He had studied the mistakes of other serial killers and had developed strategies for avoiding the patterns that typically led to capture. Edmund's relationship with local police officers at the jury room had evolved into something that bordered on friendship. Detectives would discuss their cases with him, seeking input from someone who seemed genuinely interested in criminal psychology and investigative techniques. They had no way of knowing that Edmund was using these conversations to stay one step ahead of their investigation, learning about evidence collection procedures and investigative priorities that helped him refine his methods. As 1972 progressed, Edmund's confidence grew with each successful hunt. He had proven to himself that he could kill repeatedly without detection, and his appetite for violence was escalating rather than being satisfied by his crimes. The psychological release he gained from murdering young women had become as addictive as any drug, and he was already planning his next series of victims. The hitchhiking grounds around Santa Cruz had become Edmund's personal shopping mall of human prey. He would cruise the highways for hours, studying potential victims and learning their patterns. College students were particularly appealing targets because their disappearances were often attributed to voluntary departures rather than foul play. Edmund's physical appearance continued to work in his favor. His size made potential victims feel safe, while his articulate speech patterns and apparent intelligence suggested that he was educated and trustworthy. The contrast between his imposing physical presence and his gentle demeanor created a psychological disconnect that prevented people from recognizing the danger he represented. By the end of 1972, Edmund had refined his hunting techniques to the point where he could identify, target, and capture victims with frightening efficiency. His yellow Ford had become a familiar sight on the highways around Santa Cruz, but rather than inspiring fear, it was seen as a reliable source of safe transportation for young women who needed rides. The stage was set for an escalation in Edmund's criminal activities that would terrorize the entire region and establish him as one of California's most prolific serial killers. His success in evading detection had given him a sense of invincibility that would drive him to take increasingly bold risks in pursuit of his next victims. The hunting season was far from over, and Edmund Kemper's appetite for death was growing stronger with each passing day. The quiet college town of Santa Cruz was about to learn that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. Sometimes they hide behind gentle smiles and offer helpful rides to young women who simply want to get home safely. The year 1973 arrived with Edmund Kemper operating at the peak of his murderous efficiency. Now 24 years old and having claimed at least 4 confirmed victims, Edmund had developed a systematic approach to killing that combined intellectual sophistication with sadistic brutality. The quiet college town of Santa Cruz continued to provide him with an endless supply of potential victims, while his carefully cultivated relationships with local law enforcement gave him invaluable intelligence about the ongoing investigation. Edmund's confidence had reached dangerous levels. He had begun taking trophies from his victims, not just body parts, but personal items that he would keep as souvenirs of his conquests. Photographs, jewelry, and clothing were carefully cataloged and stored in his room at his mother's house, creating a museum of murder that existed directly under Clarnell's nose. On January 8, 1973, Edmund spotted 19-year-old Cindy Shaw hitchhiking near the UC Santa Cruz campus. Cindy was a psychology student who had been visiting friends when she decided to catch a ride back to her dormitory. The irony of a psychology student becoming the victim of one of America's most psychologically complex killers was not lost on Edmund, who later described her murder with particular satisfaction. Cindy's killing marked an escalation in Edmund's methods that demonstrated his growing sadistic sophistication. Rather than simply murdering her quickly, Edmund took her to his mother's house, the same house where Clarnell slept, completely unaware that her son was torturing and killing a young woman in the basement. The psychological thrill of committing murder while his mother was present added a new dimension to Edmund's already complex pathology. The basement became Edmund's private torture chamber, soundproofed by years of accumulated household items and isolated enough that screams couldn't penetrate to the upper floors. Edmund later described spending hours with Cindy, alternating between conversations about her psychology studies and increasingly violent sexual assaults that culminated in her strangulation death. But Edmund's treatment of Cindy's corpse revealed new depths of depravity that shocked even hardened investigators when they eventually learned the details. He engaged in extensive necrophiliac activities that lasted for days, treating the body like a life-size doll that existed solely for his pleasure. His descriptions of these activities, delivered with clinical precision during his eventual confessions, would haunt investigators for decades. The disposal of Cindy's remains demonstrated Edmund's growing confidence and his contempt for the investigative abilities of local law enforcement. Rather than hiding the body in remote locations like his previous victims, Edmund dismembered Cindy's corpse and scattered the pieces throughout Santa Cruz County, sometimes depositing body parts within miles of police stations. Most disturbingly, Edmund began keeping certain body parts as long-term trophies, storing them in his room and engaging in ongoing necrophiliac activities that extended his psychological domination over his victims far beyond their deaths. His mother's house had literally become a charnel house, with human remains stored in closets and drawers throughout Edmund's personal space. On February 5, 1973, Edmund's hunting expedition yielded a double victim scenario that would become one of his most notorious crimes. 23-year-old Rosalind Thorpe and 20-year-old Alice Liu were hitchhiking together near Santa Cruz when Edmund's yellow Ford approached. The presence of two potential victims simultaneously presented both opportunity and challenge. Edmund would need to control both women while maintaining the facade of normalcy that had served him so well. Edmund's approach to managing multiple victims revealed the tactical thinking that set him apart from less organized killers. He engaged both women in friendly conversation while subtly positioning himself to prevent either from escaping when he revealed his true intentions. His massive size worked to his advantage, making physical resistance futile even for two victims working together. The murders of Rosalind and Alice followed Edmund's established pattern, but with increased brutality that suggested his psychological needs were escalating beyond simple killing. He subjected both women to prolonged torture sessions that lasted through the night, alternating between victims to maximize their terror and his own psychological satisfaction. Edmund's post-mortem activities with Rosalind and Alice demonstrated a level of sexual pathology that placed him among the most disturbed criminals in recorded history. He later confessed to engaging in necrophiliac activities with both corpses simultaneously, creating scenarios that fulfilled fantasies he had been developing since his teenage years in psychiatric confinement. The disposal of these latest victims followed Edmund's increasingly bold pattern of scattering remains throughout the local area. But his confidence was beginning to work against him. The proliferation of body parts being discovered by hikers and residents was finally forcing law enforcement to acknowledge that they were dealing with a serial killer operating in their jurisdiction. By March 1973, the investigation into what media had dubbed the co-ed killer was intensifying, but investigators were still far from identifying Edmund as their primary suspect. His relationships with local police officers continued to provide him with inside information about the investigation, while his gentle giant persona made him seem like an unlikely candidate for such brutal crimes. Edmund's psychological state during this period was a fascinating study in escalating criminal behavior. His success in evading detection had created a sense of invincibility that was driving him to take increasingly dangerous risks. But more concerning was his growing dissatisfaction with his current victim profile. College co-eds were no longer providing the psychological stimulation he craved. The relationship with his mother had reached a toxic crescendo that was poisoning every aspect of Edmund's psychological landscape. Clarnell's verbal abuse had intensified as Edmund's behavior became more erratic and aggressive. She seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed in her son, but she attributed his transformation to laziness and social inadequacy rather than homicidal mania. On Good Friday, April 20th, 1973, the psychological pressure that had been building within Edmund's twisted psyche finally reached a breaking point. The source of his rage, the woman whose abuse had helped create the monster he had become, was about to pay the ultimate price for her role in his psychological development. Edmund's murder of his mother was perhaps the most psychologically complex crime in his entire killing spree. Clarnell represented not just a victim, but the culmination of decades of psychological warfare that had shaped Edmund's entire approach to violence and control. Her death would be both revenge and liberation, the final act that would free Edmund from the emotional chains that had bound him to his criminal behavior. The murder took place in Clarnell's bedroom while she slept, defenseless and unaware that her son had finally reached the point where his homicidal fantasies had overcome his psychological dependence on her abuse. Edmund used a hammer to crush her skull, then decapitated the corpse with a knife, removing the head that had spoken so many poisonous words throughout his childhood and adolescence. But Edmund's treatment of his mother's corpse revealed the depth of his psychological pathology in ways that were almost incomprehensible to normal human understanding. He engaged in acts of desecration and violation that represented his ultimate triumph over the woman who had controlled and tormented him for so many years. The psychological release Edmund experienced after killing his mother was immediate and overwhelming. For the first time in his adult life, the voice that had criticized and diminished him was permanently silenced. But rather than providing satisfaction, this victory left Edmund feeling empty and directionless. Without his mother's abuse to react against, his entire psychological framework began to collapse. Edmund's final victim was Sally Hallett, his mother's best friend and co-worker, who arrived at the house the following day for a dinner invitation that Clarnell had extended before her death. Edmund murdered Sally to eliminate a witness, but also to postpone the discovery of his mother's corpse and buy himself time to plan his next moves. The killing of Sally Hallett was markedly different from Edmund's previous murders. Where his earlier crimes had been driven by sexual pathology and psychological dominance, Sally's death was purely tactical, a calculated decision to maintain operational security rather than satisfy psychological needs. This distinction would later prove significant to criminal psychologists studying Edmund's behavioral patterns. With both women dead and their bodies hidden within the house, Edmund faced a decision that would determine whether he continued his killing spree or brought his criminal career to a close. The psychological satisfaction he had sought through murdering his mother had failed to materialize in the way he had anticipated. Instead of feeling liberated, Edmund found himself experiencing an existential emptiness that made further killing seem pointless. For 3 days, Edmund remained in the house with the decomposing corpses of his final victims, contemplating his options and coming to terms with the reality that his murder spree had reached its natural conclusion. The voice that had driven him to prove his worth through violence had been permanently silenced, leaving him without the psychological framework that had sustained his criminal activities. On April 23, 1973, Edmund made a decision that surprised law enforcement officials and criminal psychologists alike. Rather than fleeing to continue his killing in another location, or taking his own life to avoid capture, Edmund drove to a payphone in Pueblo, Colorado, and called the Santa Cruz Police Department to confess to his crimes. The confession phone call was perhaps the most chilling conversation in American criminal history. Edmund's voice remained calm and conversational as he provided investigators with detailed information about multiple murders, the locations of body parts, and evidence that could be used to confirm his claims. When skeptical officers suggested that he might be a prank caller, Edmund provided details about crime scenes that only the actual killer could have known. "I have killed 10 people," Edmund told the dispatcher with the same tone others might use to report a minor traffic accident. "You will find my mother and her friend at 609 Ord Drive in Aptos. I have information about the co-ed killings that have been happening around Santa Cruz." The massive manhunt that followed Edmund's confession revealed the full scope of his criminal activities and provided law enforcement with a treasure trove of evidence that would have taken years to develop through traditional investigative methods. Edmund's willingness to cooperate with investigators was unprecedented among serial killers and provided researchers with insights into criminal psychology that continued to influence law enforcement training decades later. Edmund's arrest was anticlimactic compared to the dramatic captures that typically end serial killing sprees. When officers arrived at the payphone where Edmund had called from, they found him sitting calmly in his yellow Ford, waiting to be taken into custody. His demeanor was that of someone who had completed a difficult task and was ready to move on to the next phase of his life. The interrogation sessions that followed Edmund's arrest became legendary within law enforcement circles for their depth and psychological complexity. Edmund proved to be not just cooperative, but eager to discuss his crimes in exhaustive detail. His ability to recall specific elements of each murder, combined with his articulate communication skills, provided investigators with a level of insight into serial killer psychology that was unprecedented in American criminal history. Edmund's confessions revealed a mind that had approached murder with the same methodical precision that others might apply to academic research or professional development. He had kept detailed mental notes about each crime, analyzing what had worked well and what could be improved for future victims. His descriptions of the murders were delivered without emotional content, as if he were discussing laboratory experiments rather than human lives. The physical evidence recovered based on Edmund's confessions confirmed the most horrific details of his crimes and revealed additional aspects of his pathology that hadn't been immediately apparent. Body parts were recovered from locations throughout Santa Cruz County, some so well hidden that they might never have been discovered without Edmund's assistance. Most disturbing were the trophies Edmund had kept from his victims, personal items that he had used to maintain psychological connection with his crimes long after the murders were completed. Photographs, jewelry, and clothing were found carefully stored in his bedroom, creating what investigators described as a museum of murder that demonstrated the central role his crimes had played in his daily life. Edmund's trial became a media sensation that captured national attention and established him as one of America's most notorious serial killers. His physical presence in the courtroom was overwhelming. The gentle giant whose soft-spoken testimony about unspeakable crimes created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult for observers to process. The prosecution faced the unusual challenge of trying a defendant who was not only willing to confess, but eager to provide detailed testimony about his crimes. Edmund seemed to view the trial as an opportunity to educate the public about criminal psychology rather than a legal proceeding that might result in his execution. Edmund's testimony revealed a mind that had never lost its intellectual capabilities even while descending into homicidal madness. His ability to analyze his own psychological development and criminal behavior was sophisticated enough to rival professional psychiatric evaluations. He discussed his crimes with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying his own research data. The jury's deliberation was brief. Edmund's confessions and the overwhelming physical evidence made questions of guilt or innocence purely academic. But the sentencing phase proved more complex as attorneys and psychologists debated whether someone with Edmund's level of psychological sophistication could be considered legally insane despite his obvious mental illness. Edmund himself requested the death penalty, arguing that his crimes were so heinous that execution was the only appropriate punishment. His request was denied. California had temporarily suspended capital punishment, leaving life imprisonment without possibility of parole as the maximum available sentence. On November 8, 1973, Edmund Emil Kemper III was sentenced to serve 8 concurrent life sentences at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. The judge's final words captured the magnitude of Edmund's crimes and their impact on the community. In my years on the bench, I have never encountered a defendant whose actions have so thoroughly violated the basic principles of human decency. Edmund's incarceration marked the end of one of California's most terrifying crime sprees, but it also began a new chapter in criminal psychology research. His continued willingness to cooperate with researchers and law enforcement officials has provided insights into serial killer behavior that have influenced investigative techniques and psychiatric treatment approaches for decades. The legacy of Edmund Kemper's crimes extends far beyond the 10 lives he claimed during his killing spree. His case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approach serial killer investigations, how mental health professionals assess violent patients, and how society understands the complex relationship between intelligence and criminal behavior. Today, more than 50 years after his first murders, Edmund Kemper remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility, having been denied parole multiple times due to the heinous nature of his crimes and his continued assessment as a danger to public safety. His story serves as a reminder that monsters can hide behind the most seemingly innocent facades, and that the capacity for evil can coexist with intellectual brilliance in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of human nature. The co-ed killer's reign of terror may have ended with his voluntary surrender, but the questions his crimes raised about the nature of evil, the effectiveness of psychiatric treatment, and the possibility of redemption continue to haunt criminal justice professionals and researchers who study the darkest corners of the human psyche. Edmund Kemper's name will forever be associated with an era when innocence died on the highways of California, and when a community learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who appear most harmless. His crimes remain a testament to humanity's capacity for both intellectual achievement and moral depravity. a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is far thinner than most people dare to imagine. Thank you for watching and joining us as we explored these chilling and mysterious stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with others who love a good mystery. Also, let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear where in the world you're tuning in. We appreciate you being part of this, and we'll see you next time for more gripping stories. Stay safe, stay curious, and keep unraveling the unknown.